the early decades of the 19th century, before the smoke of opium drifted across the empire like a slow, unwinding shadow, China, under the Qing Dynasty, moved with the steady rhythm of a long-established world. Life unfolded gently across broad plains, tucked beneath tiled rooftops and willow trees whose branches leaned into still ponds. From the outside, and especially from the vantage of later centuries, this was a society poised at the edge of an immense transformation. But for those who lived inside it, the days followed patterns that felt timeless. Most mornings in rural provinces began in silence. A thin wash of pale light rolled over the fields as farmers stepped outside their wooden homes, pulling on the long sleeves of their tunics. The air had a softness to it, the kind that makes movements unhurried. Chickens scratched lightly near doorways, distant dogs barked without urgency. The world at this hour seemed patient. The Qing Empire, vast, layered and structured, existed like this, a great civilization held together not only by laws and rulers, but by the quiet repetition of daily acts. Tea being poured, rice being steamed, silk being woven on looms that clicked in repetitive, soothing patterns. For many people, history was not something dramatic. It arrived slowly, like dust settling on a table. In towns and cities, scholars rose early as well. They unrolled scrolls with the same careful attention that a gardener gives to a fragile plant. Studying the Confucian classics was a lifelong habit, a slow cultivation of thought. The empire's ideals were organized around harmony, balance, and order, the belief that when each person fulfilled their role, the whole society flourished. It is difficult, from the vantage of modern sensibilities, to imagine the depth of stability people felt. Dynasties had risen and fallen in the past, but the Qing, at least to ordinary eyes, felt immovable. The emperors, distant, ritual-bound figures, seemed more like features of the natural world than human authorities. Their decisions trickled downward in quiet ways, observed in tax ledgers, in standardized weights, in local magistrates who posted announcements written in bold, brush-stroked characters. Most citizens never saw the Forbidden City. They never glimpsed the red walls or the golden roofs shimmering in the Beijing sun. But they lived inside its influence. Imperial decisions reached them like delayed echoes. Subtle changes in grain prices, new instructions for registering land, adjustments to market rules. To villagers, these shifts felt as distant as the movements of constellations, present but not disruptive. Marketplaces were often the liveliest part of Qing settlement life, though even this liveliness had a kind of softness to it. Merchants arranged vegetables in neat rows, fanning themselves under the shade of cloth awnings. Children wandered between stalls, drawn to the smell of steamed buns or sesame cakes. A carpenter hammered gently at a wooden beam, his motions deliberate, unhurried. Bargaining lacked the sharpness found in other cultures. It was more a polite exchange, in which both sides tried to preserve dignity. The scents of these markets, ginger, fermented bean paste, dried tangerine peel, mixed with the faint aroma of smoke rising from cooking stoves, and above all this, you could hear the rustling of silk sleeves as people moved, the understated soundtrack of Qing social life. If one were to stand at the centre of a provincial market and simply watch, the most striking quality would be how settled everything felt. So much depended on continuity, and so continuity was honoured. The empire's great strength was its ability to preserve sameness across time. Generations farmed the same fields. Families recited the same ancestral rites. Sons followed fathers into trades. Daughters learned the same embroidery patterns their grandmothers once stitched by lamplight. This was a world highly resistant to abrupt change, not out of stubbornness, but because change made little sense in a society already considered complete. One of the empire's grand arteries, the Grand Canal, reflected this sense of calm continuity. Barges carried rice northward at a leisurely pace. The water, usually smooth except for ripples from rowing, became a mirror that caught the colours of the sky each morning and evening. Boatmen moved with measured steps, their bare feet gripping the planks as they pushed long poles into the canal bed. Many had travelled these routes for decades, memorising every bend of the waterway. Along the canal's shores, inns offered simple meals and places for travellers to sleep. You could hear the croaking of frogs at night, the distant clink of ceramic bowls, the rustle of reeds in the breeze. It was the kind of environment where time slipped by unnoticed, each day dissolving quietly into the next. This peace, this gentle, unhurried existence, formed the backdrop against which the empire would soon confront one of the most insidious forces in its history. But in these early moments, before foreign traders pushed aggressively for access, before the southern provinces were flooded with a substance that turned dreams into dependency, China seemed unshakably serene. It was this serenity, perhaps, that made the empire vulnerable. A civilization built on steady rhythms often has difficulty recognizing threats that arrive quietly. In the port city of Canton, one of the few places where foreign merchants were permitted, the atmosphere at this time was not troubled, only curious. Chinese officials supervised trade with a patient, almost ceremonial rhythm. They kept close watch, yes, but not with hostility. Their goal was order. Foreign ships were simply another part of the landscape, another feature to be regulated with the same slow discipline applied to everything else. No one, not even the merchants themselves, could yet imagine how the world behind these masts would soon pour into China, reshaping lives across every province. The empire's systems were old, perhaps too old, but they were not yet fraying. Its population was vast, its culture coherent, its administrative machine still functioning. If you were to walk through a quiet lane in Canton at dusk, you might hear the soft chatter of merchants settling accounts, the warm laughter of boatmen sharing rice wine, the rhythmic sound of someone sweeping a courtyard with a bamboo broom. You might see lanterns being lit one by one, casting small circles of light on stone walls. Nothing would suggest that anything was about to change. Tea houses were the empire's social lungs, places where the air stirred with conversation, but never rushed. Elderly men discussed poetry or weather. Travellers shared stories of distant villages. Artisans took slow sips between long work days. The sound of boiling water had a soothing constancy, like rain falling on a tiled roof. These rooms held the essence of Qing life, calm, predictable, comfortable. People believed in cycles, of seasons, of dynasties, of family lines. They believed that the empire too had a cyclical rhythm, but few imagined they were living near the end of one. For now, everything felt intact. The brocades woven in Suzhou shimmered. Rice harvests continued. The emperor performed rituals that had been repeated for centuries. Urban elites hosted poetry gatherings in gardens where moonlight filtered through plum blossoms. Life, in its details, was gentle. This gentleness would make the coming crisis even more profound, because opium did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a slow, drifting fog, so subtle at first that few noticed the shift in the air. In many towns, ancestral halls formed the centre of spiritual life. Families visited them not out of obligation alone, but out of quiet habit, rituals woven so deeply into the rhythm of existence that they were nearly subconscious. The scent of incense would cling to the wooden beams, rising in thin spirals that dissolved into the upper shadows. Children learned early how to bow, how to hold their hands, how to speak softly in those echoing rooms. These ancestral tablets represented continuity, the belief that the living were supported by generations behind them. This sense that the past could be trusted, that the old ways had carried the empire this far and would carry it still, was one of Qing China's great anchors. It offered comfort, stability, and a feeling that life was part of something larger. But it also meant that change of any kind, even benign change, was met slowly. People rarely entertained the idea that new types of goods, new habits, or new substances coming from overseas might alter the very fabric of their lives. The empire felt self-sufficient, almost serenely insulated. The outside world existed, of course, but it felt distant, like a faint echo beyond a mountain range. For most people, foreign things were curiosities, not threats. Education too followed ancient patterns. Local tutors taught children beneath open windows, letting in breezes that rustled the pages of their books. Lessons were slow, deliberate, full of repetition. Young students copied characters again and again, mastering the strokes until they became muscle memory. The goal was not innovation, but refinement, a polishing of the self through discipline. A typical school day was quiet. The sound of brush bristles on paper, soft footsteps, and the distant creaking of wooden signboards made up its soundtrack. Even laughter, when it bubbled up, was usually gentle. Children were taught to sit upright, to breathe evenly, to approach learning as a lifelong path rather than a competitive race. Outside in the courtyard, potted plants stood in rows. Teachers watered them in the mornings, regarding them almost as extensions of their own practice. In many ways, this was how Qing society imagined itself, a carefully tended garden where traditions were the soil and daily rituals were the gentle watering that kept everything alive. The world felt stable because everyone played their part in maintaining its balance. If you walked into the countryside, where most of the population lived, you would find an even deeper stillness. Rice fields stretched out in orderly rows, water glinting under the soft sun. Farmers worked without haste, their movements shaped by seasons rather than clocks. Planting, tending, harvesting, these cycles governed their lives, each step guided by weather, soil, and ancestral knowledge. Families in rural areas depended on cooperation. One household might help another repair a roof. During harvest, multiple families gathered together to bundle sheaves of rice or carry baskets along narrow paths. There was effort, yes, but it was unhurried, the kind of work that had been done for so many centuries that it felt woven into the land itself. Evenings were perhaps the most peaceful time. After long hours in the fields, people sat on wooden stools outside their homes, letting the last warmth of the day wash over them. A pot of tea would be shared. Children played in the dust. Dogs slept near the doorway. And as lanterns flickered to life, conversations became quieter, softer, fading into the rhythm of cicadas. Most villagers didn't worry about global movements or imperial politics. Their concerns were intimate: a good harvest, a child's progress in school, the health of elderly parents. And while hardships existed, famines, floods, taxes, they were seen as the natural fluctuations of life, not signs of impending collapse. The coming storm was invisible at this level. That was what made it so devastating. In county offices where the empire's bureaucracy touched everyday life, order was maintained with predictable calm. Magistrates heard disputes in rooms filled with scrolls and ledgers. Clerks dipped their brushes into inkstones with practiced ease. When peasants arrived with petitions or land questions, they waited patiently, hands folded, knowing the process would unfold at its own pace. The Qing administrative structure was layered but steady. Officials rotated through posts regularly, bringing with them new preferences but the same overarching expectations. Maintain harmony, collect taxes fairly, resolve conflicts quietly. When corruption appeared, as it did in any system, it was usually discreet. Even misdeeds tended to follow the slower rhythm of the culture, concealed beneath layers of etiquette and ritual. For centuries, this structure had served China well. It had preserved stability across vast distances, diverse populations, and shifting dynastic fortunes. Many officials believed it would continue to function indefinitely. Even those who sensed problems coming felt no urgency. After all, the empire had weathered difficulties before: rebellions, invasions, internal power struggles. Everything eventually returned to stillness. Why should the future be different? In this confidence, a quiet vulnerability took root. Inside urban homes, life revolved around family. Multiple generations lived under one roof, sharing responsibilities in ways that created strong bonds. Grandparents cared for young children. Parents oversaw household accounts. Elders advised younger adults on marriage, work, and etiquette. Meals were communal, often eaten in calm conversation. Simple dishes, steamed fish, vegetables seasoned lightly with ginger, bowls of rice, were served with tea. There was comfort in the familiarity of these routines. People didn't seek novelty, they sought harmony. At night, when lamps were extinguished one by one, you could walk through a residential lane and hear very little. Perhaps a lullaby sung gently to a child. Perhaps the distant clack of a night watchman's wooden clappers. But mostly, there was quiet. This quiet was not emptiness. It was the sound of a society that believed itself steady and whole. Had you asked anyone in those years whether China stood on the brink of a crisis, most would have smiled softly and dismissed the idea. How could such danger exist in a world so carefully maintained, so deeply rooted in tradition, so self-contained? The empire felt eternal. From within the Forbidden City, life appeared even more stable. The emperor moved through rituals embedded in centuries of tradition, solemn, precise, unchanging. Servants glided across polished floors carrying scrolls or lacquered trays. Eunuchs communicated in soft voices. Everything was choreographed like a slow, deliberate dance, meant to hold the empire in equilibrium. The emperor was not always powerful in practice, but he was powerful in symbolism. To the people, he represented continuity. To the officials, he represented the legitimacy of order. And even to foreign observers, he seemed a figure wrapped in timeless grandeur. But while the palace preserved the illusion of permanence, change was creeping closer from beyond China's shores. Foreign traders, driven by the needs of their own economies, would soon push against the boundaries of Qing restrictions. Their ships, heavy with goods and ambition, waited quietly on distant waters. One day, they would bring something else, something small, powdered, portable, and potent. Something that could slip silently into tea houses, bedrooms, marketplaces and farms. Something that would not challenge China with armies at first, but with smoke. But for now, in these last calm years, the empire slept peacefully, unaware of the shadow forming on its horizon. In the southern provinces, especially near the Pearl River Delta, nights carried their own unique serenity. Waterways shaped life here, the canals, the marshlands, the slow, winding rivers. As evening deepened, the world took on the colours of inkwash, soft blacks, grey-blue shadows, faint silvery reflections where moonlight touched water. Families living along the river moved with an unhurried confidence, stepping from dock to boat as if crossing a familiar threshold. Many made their living ferrying goods between small towns: clay tiles, dried fish, baskets of fruit, bolts of coarse cotton. The river was a messenger, carrying both necessities and news between distant settlements. Tonight, like every night, the water lay still. A solitary fisherman adjusted the net he had set earlier in the evening, the bamboo pole creaking gently as it shifted. A dog stretched out on a wooden plank near a doorway, ears flicking lazily at insects. All around, the dim lights of oil lamps shimmered on the rippling surface, each reflection trembling slightly, as though breathing with the night itself. It was a world content with its own quiet rhythm, a world that believed tomorrow would resemble today, and the next day would resemble all those before it. Yet somewhere beyond this peaceful scene, in distant waters stretching past the South China Sea, foreign ships drifted closer each year, carrying not only goods and silver, but intentions that no one in this tiny riverside village could yet imagine. Across the empire, in workshops large and small, the production of textiles was carried out with the same deliberate care seen everywhere else. Silk weaving, which had been refined for thousands of years, remained a point of pride. Inside these workshops, the air held the faint scent of raw silk and wood. The looms were large and sturdy, their frames smooth from generations of use. Women sat side by side, pulling threads through patterns they had memorized. Their hands moved with an elegance born of repetition, not rushed, not forced, simply steady. The room was filled with a soft clicking rhythm, like distant rain tapping on rooftops. Occasionally, one of the workers paused to stretch her fingers, then returned to her loom, her posture straight, her movements precise. These women did not know that, within a few decades, imported fabrics and changing markets would disrupt the traditions they upheld. They could not foresee how foreign trade pressures, wars and addiction would ripple outward to touch industries far removed from the coastal ports. For now, their world was peaceful, measured in woven inches and bolts completed. Time, like the thread, slipped through their fingers without resistance. High in the mountains, temples overlooked valleys filled with clouds. Monks rose before dawn, their footsteps soft on the worn stone floors. Morning chants echoed through the open halls, blending with the sound of wind passing through pine needles. It was a setting that felt detached from the concerns of the world below, an island of reflection. Travellers sometimes climbed these paths to seek guidance or offer thanks. They brought bowls of rice, vegetables or small coins. The monks accepted these offerings with gentle nods, their faces calm. If anyone mentioned foreign merchants or new goods arriving at the ports, the news felt small here, like a pebble dropped into a vast lake. The mountains had stood for centuries. Dynasties had risen and fallen, and these temples remained. Whatever this new phase of foreign activity meant, surely it would come and go like all others. This faith in cycles was comforting, but it was also misleading. The shift underway was not part of a familiar rhythm. It was something different, subtle yet relentless. But from these quiet heights, there was no way to sense it yet. In towns and cities, apothecaries served as centres of both medicine and community. Their shelves were lined with jars containing ginseng, dried tangerine peel, chrysanthemum, licorice root, and countless other remedies. Physicians, trained in classical texts, treated illnesses through balance rather than force. They spoke softly, asked questions, felt pulses with fingertips sensitive to the smallest variations. The remedies they offered were gentle. Teas, poultices, tonics, nothing abrupt or overwhelming. No one yet imagined a substance that could bypass the body's natural rhythms entirely, seizing control of desire in a single inhale. No one imagined something that would settle into the bloodstream not like medicine, nor like food, but like an echo that grew louder each time it was answered. When opium first appeared in small quantities, many apothecaries barely saw it. A rare curiosity, a foreign item tucked into the far corner of a ledger. Nothing more. Only later would these same shops witness the quiet collapse of patients who could no longer break free from the cravings in their blood. But here, at the start of the century, the drawers remained filled with familiar herbs. The physician's mortar turned slowly. Life was still whole. Scholars of the time, especially those who had passed the imperial examinations, walked through life with an air of calm purpose. Their values were shaped by centuries of Confucian philosophy, benevolence, righteousness, filial piety, and self-discipline. When they wrote poetry, it was often about the interplay between humans and nature, reflections on the moon, the sound of rain, the isolation of winter branches. They did not dwell on foreign threats or rapid change. Such topics felt unfitting for cultivated minds. Standing on bridges or hilltops, scholars often recited verses about permanence, about the constancy of mountains, about the unchanging flow of tradition. Their contemplative lives reinforced the empire's sense of stability. Had someone warned them that their world would soon be shaken, slowly at first, then with increasing force, they might have smiled politely and changed the subject to chrysanthemums or moon viewing. For them, the idea of collapse was almost impossible to hold, and yet, in the far south at Canton, the only port open to direct foreign trade, subtle signs of change were already unfolding. On the waterfront promenade, one could see silhouettes of Chinese merchants, boatmen, dock workers, and officials filling the space with an energy that was calm but alert. Beyond them, across the gentle waves, foreign ships rested like dark shapes against the fading light. These ships had come for tea, porcelain, silk, the treasures of the East that Europe desired intensely. They brought silver in exchange. The system was simple, controlled, even elegant. Chinese goods flowed outward, foreign silver flowed inward. And the Qing government saw no reason to adjust this arrangement. But on the decks of those foreign vessels, conversations drifted about imbalance, about how too much silver left their country and too little returned in exchange. Foreign merchants whispered about a solution, one that would bring the Chinese to trade more freely, willingly, even desperately. None in Canton yet foresaw how this imbalance would grow into conflict. The waters looked peaceful, the markets bustled calmly, the empire's rules seemed firm. The danger was still distant, still faint, still resting quietly beyond the horizon. Night fell exiting across the empire. Families prepared for rest in simple, time-honoured ways. Beds were arranged. Quilts were shaken out. An oil lamp burned low, then was pinched dark. Outside, a breeze moved through bamboo groves with a sound like whispering. In these final moments before sleep, the Qing Dynasty appeared exactly as its people believed it to be. Vast, ancient, harmonious, serene. No one imagined that within a few short decades, opium smoke would drift into bedrooms like this, first lightly, then heavily, curling into the corners of homes that had once felt untouched by the outside world. No one imagined that a single substance could unravel the routines of generations, weaken the bodies of farmers and soldiers, cloud the decisions of officials, or shift the balance between great empires. But all of that lay ahead. For now, China slept under a calm moon, unaware that its long era of stillness was nearing its last peaceful chapter.
The second chapter begins not with drama, nor with empire-wide declarations, but with the gentle sound of water being ladled into an iron kettle, somewhere in the interior of the Qing heartland. There is no rush here, only the slow, familiar cadence of life unfolding in ways that had remained unchanged for centuries. The sun has not yet risen fully. A faint, pale, gray light settles across the tiled roofs of a small market town, somewhere between Beijing's grandeur and the rice valleys of Jiangnan. Roosters call in the distance, not loudly, but with the same half-hearted intention they seem to give every morning. A thin layer of mist drifts between courtyards, softening edges, blurring corners, and making the world appear as if it is still deciding whether to wake or return to sleep. In a modest courtyard, a man in plain cotton robes slides open the wooden lattice door. He stands still, completely still, for a long moment, savoring the quiet. The faint scent of tea leaves drying in baskets, mixed with a trace of last night's extinguished oil lamp, fills the air. He exhales slowly, the breath visible in the coolness of dawn. Inside the kitchen, the kettle begins to breathe, a quiet hiss, then a shivering tremble, then steam curling upward like pale silk. This was how millions of mornings began in the Qing Dynasty, softly, repetitively, lives held together by ritual, by predictable rhythms, by the comfort of simplicity. And within this quiet world, within this slow dance of tea, smoke, and dawn, an empire that once seemed unshakable drifted toward its slow unraveling, one peaceful morning at a time. For ordinary townspeople, life during the Middle Qing Dynasty was governed not by emperors or edicts, but by routine. Routines so ingrained that people could perform them half asleep, as though guided by memory older than themselves. The day began with water and fire. Before any thought of work, before shopkeepers removed the wooden shutters from their storefronts, before students began copying lines of calligraphy, people prepared water. Cold wells, stone basins, tin ladles, clay kettles, every household had its arrangement. The water was heated not only for tea, but for the simple ritual of washing one's face and hands, a small cleansing that set the tone for the day. There was something deeply calming in this predictability, a kind of reassurance, a whisper that said, "The world has not changed overnight." The man in our imaginary courtyard, let us call him Zhou Liang, though his name does not matter, moves through these gestures without hurry. He knows precisely how long the kettle needs, when the fire should be fed, how the flavor of the tea leaves shifts with the water's temperature. His wife, already awake, is grinding soybeans for breakfast. Her movement is rhythmic, almost musical. Stone against stone, grind after grind, the soft thud of the wooden ladle tapping the side of the bowl. These sounds, the grinding, the boiling, the faint crackle of wood in the stove, were the background music of Qing life. For millions, nothing felt more certain or more peaceful. By mid-morning, the quiet of private courtyards began to give way to the gentle stirring of the streets. A Qing Dynasty market town did not wake abruptly. It woke in layers. First came the pedicab pullers, stretching their arms, tying cloth bindings around their ankles, preparing for a long day of hauling passengers from one end of town to another. Their breaths formed pale clouds in the chilly air. Then came the vendors, pushing wooden carts with wheels that creaked softly under the weight of buns, noodles, tofu, bamboo steamers, or sweet pastries glazed with malt sugar. The smell of hot broth began to fill the narrow alleys, blending with the earthy scent of damp stone roads. Soon the first customers appeared, usually older men who preferred to eat outside rather than at home. They sat on small stools, sipping broth slowly, one hand wrapped around a warm bowl, as if warming more than just their fingers. Shops, too, woke at a gentle pace. Candle makers peeled wax from cool-in molds. Cloth sellers unfolded bolts of cotton dyed in indigo or light walnut brown. Herbalists arranged their jars in the front window, each containing roots, leaves, or powders with names as old as the empire itself. Nothing about the scene was rushed. Nothing demanded haste. Life itself seemed to whisper, "Walk slower. Breathe slower. There is enough time." And it is in this tranquility that we begin to understand how the empire fell. Not through chaos at first, but through a kind of stillness that made it easy not to notice the cracks. Among the social classes of Qing society, few moved as gently and deliberately as the scholar gentry. For a young scholar in a modest town, the morning began with the sweeping of the courtyard. Not a vigorous sweep, but one guided by elegance, like a moving meditation. This was followed by calligraphy practice. Brush strokes slow, steady, as if each stroke carried the weight of one's future. Imagine a small study room, a table polished by decades of use, inkstones arranged with care, a bamboo brush holder, scrolls neatly rolled along a shelf. Light filtered in through the paper window, dim but soft, ideal for focusing the mind. Many scholars prepared for the civil service examinations, the backbone of Qing governance, an institution already beginning to strain under its own rigidity, though few noticed. To the scholar, the empire's problems felt distant. His world was this brush, this table, this single character he practiced again and again. The rhythm was slow, peaceful, serene. And yet the future of the empire rested on young men like him, men who lived in worlds so quiet they could barely hear the distant thunder of change. While men moved through town, women continued the domestic tasks that sustained the rhythm of Qing society. On laundry days, clothes were taken to communal stone basins near the canal. The sound of fabric being washed, steady slaps against cold water, created a kind of gentle percussion. Children played nearby, their laughter soft and restrained, rarely loud enough to disturb adults. Little girls collected fallen leaves to use in pretend cooking games. Boys used twigs to draw characters in the dirt. In wealthier households, women embroidered by the window, stitching scenes of rivers, birds, clouds, or blooming branches onto silk. The slowness of embroidery was its beauty. A single sleeve could take weeks. A robe could take months. In rural villages, women tended vegetable plots, kneaded dough for steamed buns, plucked feathers from chickens, or repaired fishing nets. None of these tasks were glamorous. None would appear in official histories, but they were the quiet forces that sustained life through centuries of calm and, eventually, through centuries of decline. In the middle of the day, something remarkable happened in Qing towns. Life slowed even further. Shops dimmed their lanterns. vendors retreated into shade. Those with fields returned home temporarily, avoiding the harshness of noon. Even the animals seemed to respect the pause, dogs lying in shaded alleys, chickens resting under bamboo baskets, buffalo in the countryside standing motionless in cool mud. Zhou Liang, our quiet townsman, finished his morning work repairing wooden stools for neighbors. After lunch, rice, steamed greens, perhaps a small slice of salted fish, he sat beneath the jujube tree in his courtyard. He did nothing for a while, absolutely nothing. He simply breathed, letting the warm stillness settle over him like a soft blanket. This was not laziness. This was balance. For centuries, Chinese life revolved around natural rhythms, working when the world was cool and slow, resting when the world was hot and still. This midday calm acted as a kind of collective meditation, an entire town breathing in unison, an entire empire pausing from its own vastness. How far away the looming storm of opium must have felt. By late afternoon, the town stirred once more, pushing gradually toward the rhythm of evening. Children returned to their studies, sometimes memorizing Confucian passages, sometimes copying characters onto wooden boards dusted with powder. Teachers, patient and slow-spoken, guided them with a calm firmness. Farmers checked their fields again, pulling weeds or adjusting simple irrigation channels. The rows of rice paddies reflected the sky like mirrors, broken only by the faint ripples of wind. Craftsmen returned to their benches. Bamboo workers cut thin strips for baskets. Barbers set up low stools by the street and sharpened their blades. Even workers with repetitive tasks, like bean curd makers, moved with an unmistakable grace. Their actions were not frantic, but methodical, as if every motion had been refined by generations before them. This was the life that opium would one day unweave, thread by thread. A life built on continuity, on slowness, on being satisfied with enough. But for now, at this moment in the chapter, the world remains peaceful. As dusk approached, lanterns began to glow throughout the town. Some were plain paper lanterns with simple characters written on them: peace, fortune, home. Others were painted with modest scenes: cranes flying across clouds, lotus blossoms, mountains in distant mist. Families gathered for dinner, not a hurried affair, but a slow, quiet meal where conversation flowed gently. Rice steamed in clay pots. Vegetables simmered with ginger. Occasionally, someone brought a small flask of warmed rice wine. After dinner, neighbors visited one another, sitting on bamboo stools in shared courtyards. Stories were exchanged. Jokes were told softly. Children played lantern tag, their gleaming lights bobbing like small stars moving across the earth. It was in these moments, these soft, glowing evenings, that the Qing world felt eternal, unshakable, unchangeable. The empire's problems, corruption, foreign intrusion, the booming underground opium trade, were distant thunderclouds beyond mountains few bothered to climb. Tonight, all that mattered was the smell of warm rice, the sound of distant crickets, and the glow of lanterns swaying lightly in the breeze. As the night deepened, the town fell into its familiar quiet. Shops shuttered. The last lanterns dimmed. The air cooled just enough to bring relief from the day's warmth. Zhou Liang extinguished the oil lamp in his home and stepped outside. He looked at the moon, a pale, round disk floating above the rooftops. How peaceful this world must have felt. How certain. How impossibly stable. And yet, unknown to most, the empire was already balancing on a thin edge. While towns like this slipped into sleep, ships in distant coastal waters carried crates filled with strange brown resin. Coastal smugglers whispered profit. Local officials whispered bribes. Foreign traders whispered opportunities. But here, in this quiet inland town, no one felt the shift. How could they? Life was too serene, too circular, too bound to the comforting rhythm of the familiar. The collapse of the Qing Dynasty did not begin with fire. It began in towns just like this. Towns that believed tomorrow would always resemble yesterday. Silent towns. Peaceful towns. Towns that fell asleep beneath a sky that was slowly, unknowingly darkening. This chapter closes on that peaceful, fragile stillness. The stillness before the storm. The chapter begins not with danger, nor with conflict, but with something far more subtle. A ship drifting across a calm sea. Long before opium became a national crisis, before wars and treaties and humiliations, its presence began as nothing more than a faint ripple on waters so still they mirrored the sky. Far from the inland towns we visited earlier, a pale morning light rests on the Pearl River Delta. The sea, smooth as glass, reflects low gray clouds drifting in from the horizon. On this mirror-like surface, foreign ships, heavy, slow, and unfamiliar, glide toward the southern ports. They do not hurry. They do not announce themselves. Their sails shift quietly, catching the wind like the wings of slow, patient birds. Below deck, tightly packed chests sit quietly in the dim light. Their contents are unknown to most of the crew, and certainly unseen by the villagers along the riverbanks. At this early stage, the chests hold more tea, wool, metal, spices, common goods for trade. Only a few contain something else, something wrapped not only in cloth, but in silence. Opium. Yet even here, at the beginning, it is not a danger. Not yet. It is merely a curiosity, a commodity, a whisper. The empire sleeps on, unaware that something small, something almost invisible at first, is drifting closer. To understand the first shadows of opium, we must first understand Canton, the empire's southern gateway, long before trouble began. Canton was unlike the quiet inland towns of Chapter 2. It was a place where voices mingled, where dialects blended, where the smell of unfamiliar spices drifted through the humid air. And yet, even here, life moved at a slow, steady pace. The day began with heavy fog rising from the Pearl River, settling over the foreign factories like a thin veil. Chinese workers carried bundles on bamboo poles, their silhouettes softened by the mist. Fishermen prepared their nets, while cormorants perched quietly on their boats, as though meditating. On the riverbanks, merchants brewed morning tea in small clay pots. The steam curled upward, dissolving into the damp air. Nothing about their morning routine suggested that history was slowly turning beneath their feet. Foreign traders, newly arrived, looked out from their quarters with curiosity. They watched the slow elegance of the city waking up, the measured steps of port workers, the muted chatter in the tea stalls. They saw a world ancient, proud, and serene. But they did not yet see its vulnerabilities, nor did the Chinese see theirs. For the moment, the only thing that mattered was the day's business: cloth for tea, metal tools for porcelain, spices for silk. Trade was simple, predictable, mutually beneficial. No one spoke yet of opium, not openly. The first Western traders who lived in Canton did so under strict restrictions. They were confined to a series of factories, not industrial buildings, but gated trading compounds clustered along the river. They could not bring families. They could not roam the countryside. They could not learn Chinese freely. They could not trade directly with commoners. To many of them, life felt like a gentle prison. Predictable days, long afternoons of paperwork, warm nights overlooking a river that never hurried. And yet, boredom creates opportunity. Some traders, confined to their foreign quarters, began seeking goods that could be exchanged at high profit. Tea was prized in Europe, but payment in silver strained their companies. Porcelain and silk were adored, but costly. They needed something, anything, the Chinese would buy in return. For a long time, nothing seemed promising. And then, one day, in a quiet conversation behind a warehouse, a local broker mentioned something in a lowered voice. Something rare, something potent, something already known to a few in certain circles. A medicine, he called it, a balm for the mind, a small luxury. The broker spoke softly, as if the very air might carry the words into the wrong ears. The foreign trader wasn't entirely sure what he had just been offered. Only later would he understand that this medicine was the same substance already used recreationally in parts of Asia: opium. But at this early point, neither saw it as dangerous. It was merely another commodity, small, valuable, discreet. And the empire felt too massive, too ancient, too stable to be threatened by something so small. The earliest opium transactions were barely noticeable. They happened behind warehouses, under the shade of banyan trees, or on the decks of anchored boats in the Pearl River's quieter bends. Small quantities moved from hand to hand, wrapped in cloth, hidden among bundles of more legitimate goods. To most, it looked like nothing more than herbal medicine, something mixed into traditional remedies, something for the wealthy to experiment with in private rooms lit by lanterns. The scale was tiny. A few chests here, a few pipes there, a few curious buyers, mostly elites. Foreign traders did not yet imagine widespread addiction. Local Chinese officials did not yet imagine crisis. Ordinary citizens barely even knew the substance existed. It was like a drizzle on dry soil, so faint that one would never assume it could become a flood. If someone walked through Canton's narrow alleys at this time, they would see a herbalist grinding roots, a scholar carrying books wrapped in silk, a boatman unloading rice sacks, a monk chanting quietly in a riverside temple. Life was too full, too steady, too deeply rooted for anyone to notice the quiet shift beginning beneath the surface. And so the first shadows went unseen, soft, light, harmless looking. The kind of shadows that pass over a landscape without changing its color. While Canton was slowly becoming a gateway to something new, inland towns remained blissfully unaware. In the same towns we visited in Chapter 2, life followed the same rituals. The grinding of soybeans at dawn, the slow movement of vendors, the rhythmic clatter of carpenters at work. Children memorizing their characters, scholars practicing their brushstrokes. Not a single soul in these towns had ever heard the word opium. Not one had seen a foreigner. Not one could imagine a drug strong enough to reshape entire lives. The Qing Empire was vast. Its heartlands were insulated. News traveled slowly. Warnings traveled slower, and so the earliest opium shipments passed unnoticed by the very people whose future they would eventually alter. Even the educated gentry saw no cause for concern. In their minds, China had weathered countless storms, rebellions, famines, dynastic changes, foreign arrivals. What threat could a medicinal resin possibly pose? So they continued their routines, unhurried and unworried. If opium was a shadow, inland China was sleeping with its lantern extinguished. In these early years, opium was not yet monstrous. It was not even widely condemned. Physicians in Canton sometimes mixed it with medicinal herbs for digestive issues or pain management. Wealthy merchants experimented with it out of curiosity, seeking the dreamy relaxation it provided. Smoking bowls were small, often used only occasionally. The effects were mild. Addiction was rare. An evening scene inside a merchant's residence might look like this. A small, dim room lit by a single lantern, a scroll painting hanging on the wall, mountains in mist. Two merchants seated on floor cushions, sipping warm wine. A lacquer box containing a few opium pellets resting on a low table. They share a pipe the way others might share a cup of tea, slowly, quietly, with no sense of danger. After a few breaths, a soft heaviness settles over them, like warm water filling the body from the inside out. Their conversation drifts, becoming slower, almost poetic. One of them hums a tune. A gentle laugh escapes. Outside, the city remains silent. The river moves. The lantern sways. Nothing feels harmful. Nothing feels frightening. Nothing feels world-changing. But the first seeds are being planted in minds, in habits, in markets. Seeds that will grow not with explosions, but with slow, creeping roots. Even in these earliest days, however, a few voices whispered warnings. A stern herbalist in Canton might refuse to sell poppy-based remedies to certain customers, fearing misuse. A Confucian scholar might write a brief note in his diary. Some men indulge in a foreign substance that clouds the mind. Its comfort is false. A coastal magistrate might quietly inquire why certain ships lingered longer than usual offshore. But these warnings were small, barely ripples in the vast river of Qing society. No one felt alarmed. The scale was too tiny, the effects too limited. The empire too enormous. It was like hearing a twig snap in a large forest, noticeable, but not enough to interrupt one's walk. And so the early concerns faded into the background. Life continued. Tea was poured. Rice was harvested. Lanterns were lit. The river flowed. History shifted, almost imperceptibly. As the months turned into years, foreign traders took careful notes. They observed which Chinese merchants were willing to experiment, which herbalists bought small quantities, which officials could be bribed quietly, which river routes allowed discreet movement. The traders themselves were not driven by malice. They were driven by economics. And opium, even in small amounts, produced profits far beyond most other goods. Its price per weight was astonishing. Its demand, though small, was steady. Its secrecy made it appealing. So the calculations continued. If 10 chests sell easily, could 30? If 30 sell, could 100? Would the Chinese truly object, so long as the trade remains discreet? Would the government notice? And if they noticed, would they really act? The sea breeze carried these questions away. Their answers would not be clear for decades, but the traders felt opportunity growing beneath their feet like a quiet tide, and tides always rise slowly before they become impossible to resist. The chapter ends with a quiet image. A single opium pellet, small, dark, harmless-looking, resting on a polished wooden table in a Canton merchant's home. A tiny object, no larger than a fingertip, its shadow barely noticeable in the lantern light. Outside, the night is utterly still. The river drifts softly toward the sea. A few stars shimmer through the humid air. No alarms, no panicked cries, no sense of catastrophe. And yet this tiny pellet, this speck of processed poppy resin, carries within it the first thread that will eventually unravel the Qing Dynasty. Not with thunder, not with flames, but with the slow, creeping quiet of addiction and dependency. A shadow has entered the empire. Not a large one, not yet, but enough for history to exhale, softly, as the chapter closes. The first shadows of opium did not arrive with thunder, nor with the sound of weapons, nor even with the stern proclamations of mandarins. They arrived almost like a rumor, a passing whisper carried by boatmen, a faint scent mixed among spices and foreign tobacco. A small clay pipe, forgotten or left behind by a sailor in a tea-house. Almost nothing, and yet something that the people of the time would later recall with a quiet, regretful clarity. In the early years, opium was not yet a crisis, not yet the specter that would haunt the dynasty. It sat on small shelves in the homes of apothecaries, next to dried tangerine peels and preserved lotus seeds. It traveled in tiny parcels, no larger than a closed hand, wrapped in paper softened by the humidity of the southern ports. Its presence was tolerated because it seemed harmless, just another medicinal ingredient among hundreds China had used for centuries. If one walked through the interior of Guangzhou's narrow market lanes, early in the morning before the crowds gathered, they might barely notice the drug at all. The shops were busy with other concerns. Jars of incense powders stacked to the ceiling, medicinal roots bundled together like sleeping serpents, small porcelain bowls painted with cranes and pine trees. The air was warm and heavy with pollen, spices, and the faint crackle of roasting tea leaves. But one corner of these shops often held a tiny drawer, unmarked except for a thin character brushed in faded ink. Ah Fu Rong. Its price was modest, its reputation unremarkable. The people who bought it then did not imagine they were contributing to anything more than their own comfort. And yet, every great tragedy begins somewhere. It was the men who carried crates on their backs, the lifeblood of the port, who first remarked upon its presence, not with fear, but with curiosity. These men were not scholars or merchants, nor did they concern themselves with the inner workings of foreign trade policies. They simply moved what was placed before them and followed the tides of business like reeds drifting on a quiet river. One such man, according to later accounts, commented in passing, "The foreigners bring oil that burns too sweetly for lamps. Perhaps it is a kind of spice." But it was no spice, only the beginning of something far more enduring. Bundles of opium, hidden inside chests of cotton or jars of pepper, arrived quietly, concealed beneath the mundane cargo that everyone expected. The porters did not question the contents. They merely noted the odd smell, sweet but heavy, reminiscent of damp earth after rain. At night, when the docks grew silent, that smell lingered like a faint, persistent memory. In the countryside, where people lived by the turning of seasons rather than the movement of ships, opium made its first appearance through traveling physicians. These men carried medicine boxes with sliding compartments, and their visits to villages were welcomed events. They set up their tables near ancestral temples, their wooden signs decorated with green dragons and cranes, symbols of longevity and health. These physicians did not speak dramatically of their remedies, they whispered them. They explained that a pinch of poppy resin could calm coughing fits, ease restless sleep, or soothe aches in the back. To weary farmers and elderly grandparents, these promises felt like kindness. Sometimes a physician would prepare a small infusion in hot water, letting the resin melt slowly until the liquid turned the color of weak tea. They would hand the cup to the patient with a soft, knowing nod. For many, it brought relief. But already a pattern had begun, a sense of comfort that begged to be repeated. Only a few travelers raised concerns, noting that some patients asked for more than their ailments justified. But these voices were small, and the villages themselves had larger worries: failed harvests, the rising price of rice, the need to repair dikes along swollen rivers. A substance that brought warmth and forgetfulness was easy to overlook. In the riverside tea houses of the Lingnan region, opium's presence grew not through desperation, but through experimentation. Patrons brought it with them as oddities, gifts from foreign sailors, or spoils from chance encounters with merchants. A small lump could be passed from hand to hand, examined with curiosity. A few might light it in a pipe simply to understand why the foreigners valued it. At this stage, the mood around opium was far from dark. The conversations of the time were gentle, almost dismissive. It makes your limbs heavy. It clears the mind, but also clouds it. One uses it only on cold nights. It is no more dangerous than strong wine. The pipes used then were simple, thin bamboo tubes with small clay bowls attached. They lacked the elaborate designs that would become infamous in later years. Men smoked rarely, sometimes only once to satisfy a passing curiosity, then returned to their tea, conversations, and quiet games of Wei Qi. But curiosity is a root that grows easily, and from this root, unseen branches were beginning to spread. While opium's presence among ordinary people was still faint, the foreign traders saw its potential with clarity. They watched the sailors, port workers, and tea-house patrons with quiet interest. Every time a pipe was smoked, they saw something that local officials could not yet perceive: a future market. And so they increased the shipments, slowly at first. They hid them behind bales of cotton or camphor. They charted the appetite of the city like scholars studying the growth of a new crop. But they made no noise about it. No proclamations, no open advertisements. Just shadows moving in the early dawn as boats drifted downriver, carrying small quantities upriver to towns that would later recall this period with a sense of lost innocence. There is a recorded mention in the diary of a provincial scholar, anonymous but believed to have lived in the Guangzhou area, who wrote of a troubling detail in the winter of 1781. His entry remains one of the earliest intellectual reflections on the changing landscape of the port. This evening the docks were quieter than usual, and yet I smelled something in the air, a sweetness not of tea, nor of incense, nor of the river. I cannot name it, but I fear it may not belong to us. He was not speaking with certainty, nor with alarm, only with intuition. This scholar's life was simple. He tutored local students, wrote poetry about the river mists at dawn, and occasionally visited friends to discuss the 4 books over warm wine. But something about the new smell disturbed his routine, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. He mentioned it again months later, noting that young men in the market seemed unusually drowsy, or that some shopkeepers appeared to gaze into the distance more often. These observations were subtle, gentle ripples, not yet waves. No one listened. Not because they disagreed, but because the changes were still too faint. Shadows, nothing more. Some households, mostly wealthier ones, began to experiment with opium more deliberately. They did not smoke openly. It was considered improper, especially among the educated and the respected. Instead, people would gather in small rooms lit by lanterns with jade green glass. They would sit on cushioned mats, speaking softly, often choosing poetry as the evening's entertainment. A host might bring out a small pipe, not as the focus of the gathering, but as an accessory, like a rare tea. The experience was described as a drifting dream that does not fully take you. But even in these early instances, one could observe the beginnings of something new. A taste for escape. A willingness to step away from the pressure of examinations, the demands of business, or the growing heaviness of the times. But the dynasty was already showing early signs of strain beneath the surface. Signs not yet obvious enough to cause alarm, but real enough that people welcomed anything that eased the sense of weight they carried. None of these scenes were dramatic. No soldiers fought. No governors wrote angry decrees. No families cried out in public squares. The empire continued with its quiet routines. The morning bells of temples rang. The markets buzzed with the familiar calls of vendors. Fishermen cast their nets into calm rivers. Children memorized Confucian lines beneath the shade of banyan trees. Life appeared unchanged. Yet in the background of this everyday world, something subtle was unfolding, a slow shift in the emotional fabric of society. Opium was becoming a part of moments of rest, moments of pain, moments of leisure, moments of curiosity. Still hidden, still dismissed, still easy to ignore. But like a mist rolling over a valley, gradual and soft, it brought with it a sense of unreality that no one could yet describe. The shadow had entered the empire, not as a conqueror, but as a guest invited in with gentle hands. The earliest shadow of opium clung most strongly to the coast, resting lightly on the ports and foreign factories. But as the years crept forward, the substance began to drift inward, slowly, almost lazily, following the natural paths of the empire's waterways. It did not push. It simply went where the currents carried it. China's rivers were ancient, patient highways. They flowed through villages where children learned to read Confucian verses, through towns where blacksmiths hammered rhythmically on warm anvils, through quiet fields where women transplanted rice beneath soft spring rain. Along these waters, opium traveled not as contraband, not yet, but as an object of curiosity, tucked into bundles of traded goods, or hidden within the belongings of itinerant merchants who moved like wandering reeds across the land. Even the riverboats themselves seemed unaware of what they were carrying. Their wooden hulls creaked gently against the current, lanterns swaying at the bow, ropes tapping softly against masts. They were vessels of ordinary life, ferrying grain, cloth, medicinal herbs, small luxuries, and now a resin that had not yet revealed its weight. The earliest inland transactions were unremarkable. A merchant in a modest river town might obtain a small piece of the substance from a traveler who claimed it eased exhaustion. A scholar preparing for the provincial examinations might use it as a rare medicinal aid for sleepless nights. A gentry family might keep a tiny amount as part of a broader collection of aromatics. No one saw these acts as indulgent. No one imagined they foreshadowed crisis. They were simply choices made quietly, privately, and with no more significance than the buying of a new inkstone. The merchants who carried opium inland were not criminals. They were often elderly men who walked with straw hats and carried bamboo staffs, their backs bent from decades of hauling goods. They were middlemen by necessity, not by ambition. Their lives revolved around practical matters: weather patterns, crop yields, the condition of footpaths along the riverbanks. They brought opium because it was one more thing people wanted, a curiosity that fetched a slightly better price than dried bean curd or preserved apricots. And so the shadows spread without anyone intending it to. In one river town, its name lost to history, there is a surviving private letter that describes an early opium gathering. The tone of the letter is gentle, unhurried, and remarkably free of judgment. It simply recounts an evening spent at the house of a friend, where a group of men gathered after the festival of lanterns. They sat on bamboo mats. They poured pale rice wine into small porcelain cups. They talked about the spring floods and old exam stories. And then, as if it were nothing, the host produced a small pipe. The letter describes the moment with a tender simplicity. The smoke was light and sweet. It rose like a thin ribbon above the lamp flame. Yu Sheng laughed softly and said it reminded him of the scent of plum blossoms in early snow. We sat together in silence, feeling the night grow deeper. There is no sense of danger here, no moral weight, only an image of quiet companionship, an ordinary moment in a life that would soon be overtaken by larger forces. When historians look back on such accounts, they tend to see foreshadowing. But for the people living in those moments, it was simply a peaceful night. Among the upper classes, the arrival of opium elicited little commentary. Most gentry families were preoccupied with matters of lineage, local governance, tenant relations, and preparing their sons for the imperial examinations. Their world turned on tradition, books, and reputation. A foreign resin rarely entered their thoughts. If anything, they saw the early use of opium as somewhat unrefined, a habit better suited to sailors, laborers, or idle young men experimenting with novelty. It was not considered a threat, hardly even a trend. The gentry drank tea with chrysanthemum petals and preserved plums. They recited poems by Wang Wei and Du Fu. Their evenings were filled with the sound of the Qin, with embroidered silk curtains drawn against the cold. If a pipe of opium was present in such circles, it remained discreet and rare, introduced by a guest who wished to impress with something foreign and curious. It never became the centerpiece of the evening. In these early years, the empire felt stable enough, confident enough, that even small indulgences seemed harmless, like tiny cracks in a vast and ancient stone that no one believed could ever truly break. As opium traveled inland, it moved in rhythm with the riverboat songs, the long, low melodies sung by crews pulling ropes from the banks to help their junks move upstream. These songs were slow, heavy, almost mournful, echoing across water as smooth as jade. The men who sang them were unaware they were carrying the earliest seeds of calamity. They were simply working, living, enduring. Their boats docked at countless small towns, towns where winter fog wrapped houses in soft gray, towns where old men played Wei Qi beneath persimmon trees, towns where fishermen mended nets with fingers worn smooth from years of work. To each of these places, opium arrived not as a flood, but as a drift. A small addition to the marketplace, a quiet conversation, a tiny exchange between strangers. And in each town, life continued quietly. The land breathed with the seasons. People married, planted crops, told stories, aged. Opium threaded itself through these rhythms the way mist threads through a valley, soft, almost invisible, and yet persistent. There is a rural anecdote preserved in the writings of a Qing-era herbalist. It tells of a farmer in the Hunan region who encountered opium for the first time, not through smugglers or foreign sailors, but through a distant relative visiting from Canton. The farmer complained of aching joints from years of tending rice paddies. His relative offered him a pinch of dark, sticky resin. "Place it in hot water," he advised, "and drink before sleep. It eases the bones." The farmer did as instructed. He slept deeply. He awoke refreshed, and he thought no more of it. Opium, in these early days, rarely struck the untrained eye as something that demanded caution. It was simply another warm remedy, another small comfort in a life filled with toil. The herbalist who recorded this story noted, "The farmer used it once more that winter, when the cold was sharp. It helped him again. I do not think he ever used it afterward, for he could not afford to." This account reminds us that many early encounters with opium were brief and largely harmless. Addiction had not yet taken root. The scale of usage was too small, the resin itself too expensive for widespread habits. The shadow was still shallow, its edges soft. By the late 1700s, opium had woven itself quietly into the fabric of southern China. It existed like a distant star, visible, faint, and largely ignored. Officials occasionally mentioned it in reports, but the tone was mild, almost dismissive. The empire had other concerns: border disputes, internal bureaucracy, regional famines, tensions along the Tibetan plateau. Compared to these, opium appeared inconsequential. And yet the foreigners kept shipping it. Their interest remained steady, patient. They monitored markets with the detached calm of men studying tides. They saw the quiet acceptance. They saw the growing curiosity. They saw the shadow slowly lengthen. And, sensing opportunity, they prepared to widen the door. But for the people living through these early years, none of this felt ominous. Life continued with the same gentle rhythm. Lanterns were lit at dusk. Children practiced calligraphy in the evenings. Farmers checked their seedlings after the spring rains. Merchants counted coins by the glow of oil lamps. Opium was there, yes, but it was still only a murmur, a whisper, a shadow that touched only a few. A presence so quiet it was almost comforting. They did not yet know that shadows grow longest just before the night. There comes a moment in the unfolding of every great change when the people living through it do not yet recognize its significance. The shift is too soft, too gradual, too peaceful. It arrives not with a shout, but with a sigh. Not like a storm that breaks branches, but like mist collecting beneath leaves at dawn. For the Qing Empire, that moment came quietly during the final years of the 18th century, when opium was no longer a curiosity, nor a rare indulgence, but one small thread woven into daily life. No one could say when this shift occurred. Not scholars, not merchants, not the physicians who carried their medicine chests across the countryside. It was as if the substance simply faded into the background, settling into the routines of an empire that believed itself unshakable. If one stood on the banks of the Pearl River at dusk in those years, watching the fishing boats return under a sky softened to lavender, one would see nothing resembling crisis. Families cooked their evening meals. Children ran across the docks with laughter echoing like distant bells. Lanterns swayed gently in the warm breeze. Life went on, steady, quiet, familiar. And yet, beneath this peaceful surface, a subtle transformation was beginning. In the colder regions of the empire, Jiangnan, Hubei, parts of Sichuan, opium began to take on a slightly new role, not as a luxury, but as a remedy for winter's ache. Farmers whose joints stiffened from the icy wind turned to the resin for relief. Teachers who spent long nights copying texts by lantern light found it eased their fatigue. Mothers caring for aging parents discovered that a pinch in warm broth soothed restless sleep. These uses were small, gentle, unremarkable. A sip at night, a drop in tea, a pipe shared among close friends. And yet these habits had a way of spreading, not through intention, but through imitation. When neighbors saw how deeply the elderly slept, they asked for the secret. When teachers found the nights less burdensome, they recommended the remedy to others. No one used the word habit. No one used the word harm. They simply said, "It helps." And in a world where life demanded much, people rarely refused the things that helped. By the turn of the century, the soft glow of pipe smoke had become a familiar sight in river towns and provincial cities. Not excessive, not pervasive, just familiar. It drifted from tea-house doorways where merchants gathered after the day's business. It curled from the back rooms of inns where travelers shared stories of distant provinces. It rose in thin threads from small gardens where scholars sat beneath plum trees, reading poetry aloud to one another in low, melodic voices. The pipes themselves also began to change. They grew slightly longer, more slender, crafted with quiet craftsmanship, bamboo stems polished to a warm sheen, clay bowls decorated with cranes or camellias, brass fittings engraved with modest patterns. Nothing ostentatious, nothing decadent. The pipes of this era were tools of relaxation, not addiction. Companions to quiet nights, not symbols of escape. When people spoke of them, they did so with a softness usually reserved for favorite winter teas or familiar melodies on the chin. "A few breaths before sleep," they would say. "It settles the mind." These conversations were shared beneath lantern light, amid the gentle tapping of teacups, the rustling of silk sleeves, the hum of cicadas. In these moments, opium felt like part of the fabric of restfulness itself. As the quiet spread continued, certain trades began to feel its presence more directly. Among them were the tea merchants, who traveled frequently between inland plantations and the coastal ports. They observed patterns faster than others, not because they were watchful, but because they were always moving. From hillside farms to river docks, from marketplaces to inns, from rural villages to bustling cities. They saw that in one town, a few men smoked pipe resin in the evenings. In another, a local doctor prescribed it sparingly for sleeplessness. And in the next, young scholars passed a small lump around during poetry gatherings. The merchants did not judge these customs. They merely noted them, the way one observes shifts in tea preference. More chrysanthemum this year, less osmanthus the next. One merchant recorded in his travel diary, "Along the middle Yangtze, I see pipes more often than last winter, but people smoke with restraint. It is not a vice. It is a warmth in cold nights." Historians later emphasized this sentence, not for its accuracy, but for what it reveals about how the empire understood the growing presence. Warmth, comfort, ease. These were the words of the time, not destruction, not dependency. The shadow was still tender, almost affectionate. Long before opium dens became the ominous dens of later centuries, the earliest opium rooms were little more than peaceful annexes in wealthier homes. A small chamber with a low couch by the window, silk cushions embroidered with pale cranes, an incense burner shaped like a mountain, a single lantern with soft peach-colored glass. Here, the host and 2 or 3 close friends would sit together after a long day, speaking softly about the world, the harvest, the latest poetry, the behavior of children, the shifting prices of rice. At some point in the conversation, the pipe would appear, not ceremoniously, not as an indulgence, but as a gentle punctuation to the evening. A quiet inhalation, a relaxed exhale, a slight smile. One guest would lean against a cushion. Another would close his eyes, hearing the distant chirping of night insects. The host would pour fresh chrysanthemum tea, the steam rising like faded silk. If an observer from the future entered such a room, knowing what opium would become, they might feel a shiver of foreboding. But the people of that time felt no such thing. To them, this was merely rest, a moment of peace. And in an empire of vast distances and growing burdens, peace was welcomed. On the coast, however, a different scene unfolded. Foreign traders, Portuguese, British, and others, continued to watch the inland appetite with patient interest. They kept meticulous logs. They charted the growth. They noted which towns bought more, which seasons saw higher demand. But they did all of this quietly. Outwardly, their factories appeared as they always had. Warehouses stacked with cotton and tea, narrow offices filled with ledgers, ships rocking gently on the tide, sailors lifting crates under the pale morning sun. Nothing looked suspicious. Nothing looked hurried. The empire did not yet imagine that behind these quiet routines, a carefully calculated trade was taking shape. And why would it? China had seen centuries of foreign goods come and go. Silver, spices, ceramics, lacquerware. Opium seemed no different. A small item, a minor indulgence, a temporary fashion, something that would pass, as all curiosities do. But opium was not a curiosity, and it would not pass. Not yet. Not for a very long time. By the first years of the 19th century, the Qing Empire had entered a period historians would later call the era of gentle acceptance. Opium was neither hidden nor celebrated. It simply existed, comfortably, quietly, woven into the twilight hours of both the humble and the refined. In this period, the shadow was neither feared nor seen. It was simply lived with. Like a wandering guest who overstays but never raises his voice. Like smoke that drifts through a house but never sets off alarm. Like a soft habit that feels too small to question. Had the empire been stronger, had its coffers been fuller, its officials more disciplined, its borders more secure, perhaps the growing thread would have unraveled. But the empire was already beginning to tire. Slowly, softly, gently. And the shadow, patient as always, was ready to deepen. The afternoon sun drifted through the lattice windows of the yamen courtyard, casting long, mellow rectangles of gold over the flagstones. Time in an administrative compound often felt slower than in the rest of the town. Outside, markets rang with late-day haggling and the distant call of vendors preparing their evening meals. But here, inside these walls, one moved at the pace of ink drying on scrolls. The rhythm was deliberate, aged, and unchanging. In an outer chamber, two clerks sat cross-legged on woven mats, sorting the day's petitions. Their fingers were stained with ink, their knuckles dotted with small calluses from years of brushwork. One clerk paused occasionally, massaging the space between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the familiar soreness of long hours spent copying reports. The other clerk hummed a faint tune from a children's folk song, something about a drifting lotus leaf and a boatman who had fallen asleep at his oar, as if to anchor his mind against the monotony. The petitions were always the same: requests to settle land disputes, pleas for tax reductions during a poor harvest, reports of minor village thefts, and the occasional matter involving a wandering vagrant or a merchant caravan that had suffered an accident along the roads. Nothing in these scrolls hinted at the greater troubles the empire would one day face. The men wrote and filed and signed, believing their work was simply part of the unbroken flow of governance, not realizing how the currents beneath them were shifting. Occasionally, the scent of opium drifted faintly through a corridor. It was never overpowering, just a whisper of sweet smoke that clung to the wood beams. No one openly acknowledged it. Officially, it should not have been present at all, but everyone knew that one assistant magistrate had begun using it for what he claimed was chronic back pain. He insisted that it helped keep his mind sharp during long nights of reviewing cases. And because he continued to produce immaculate calligraphy and precise judgments, the other officials accepted his explanation with polite silence. His small indulgence did not disrupt the yamen's function, at least not yet. But the clerks noticed that he sometimes took longer pauses before answering questions. They observed how he stared slightly past them, as though listening to something distant or half-remembered. They noted how his hands trembled during the cold mornings, but steadied after he burned a little more of the dark resin in his private chamber. Still, no one spoke of it. Opium, at this stage, was something like a rumor or superstition. Known but unacknowledged, present but unspoken. It existed in the empire the way a thin mist rests in the low valleys at dawn, visible, yet somehow easy to ignore because it causes no immediate harm. A messenger walked into the courtyard carrying a bamboo tube of official documents from a neighboring county. His sandals were dusty, his hair tied in a loose knot. He knelt briefly, a gesture of respect, and handed the tube to a guard who carried it into the clerk's chamber. There, the men slid out the rolled papers and set them on the table to be reviewed. Inside one of the scrolls was a short note from a fellow magistrate, mentioning that some farmers in his district had begun using a foreign smoke to relieve aches after working the fields. At the time of writing, he reported no disturbances, no issues, only a casual observation. The tone was neutral, almost curious. The clerks glanced at each other, but neither commented. They simply added the note to the stack. If anyone had been reading carefully, they might have noticed that these references had begun appearing in reports from several neighboring towns. Not alarming, not frequent, just enough to form a pattern for those who looked closely. But life in a provincial yamen rarely allowed for such wide attention. Each day brought enough small tasks to keep every mind tethered to the immediate present. At dusk, the magistrate stepped out into the courtyard. His robes brushed lightly against the stones as he walked, and he paused to observe the lanterns being lit one by one along the covered walkways. The flames flickered at first, timid and wavering, before settling into steady points of warm light. The soft glow suited the atmosphere of the place, restrained, gentle, and slightly fatigued. He listened to the quiet laughter of young scribes washing their brushes at the stone basin, rinsing away the residue of another full day. Some complained softly about the cold water. Others spoke about the steamed buns they hoped to buy from the night market after work. Their concerns were simple, grounded in the nearness of daily life. None of them imagined that the empire they served would soon face a crisis linked to a substance so deceptively small, so easily dismissed. In an office overlooking the courtyard, the assistant magistrate closed the shutters and lowered himself onto a narrow stool. He lit a small oil lamp, its flame wavering in the dim room. The shadows on the walls moved like slow, breathing shapes. With a careful hand, he opened a wooden box that held a slim pipe and a small pouch of opium. He hesitated for a moment, not out of guilt, but out of a quiet ritual, a familiar pause before indulging in something that had become subtly entwined with his routine. The first inhalation filled him with warmth that curled gently through his chest and loosened the tight ache in his lower back. Outside, the sounds of the yamen grew softer, and for a moment he imagined he could hear the distant sigh of the river beyond the city walls. He felt the world settle into a stillness that made his responsibilities feel lighter, more manageable. When he exhaled, a thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward, slowly dispersing into the quiet air. He did not consider himself dependent. Not yet. He simply believed that he had found something to ease his pain, something that helped him work with greater clarity, and for now, it seemed harmless. He finished quickly, extinguished the pipe, and returned to reviewing documents with the calm precision expected of him. But outside his window, the lanterns flickered as the night deepened, each flame bending in the breeze like a small gesture of warning. Elsewhere in the yamen, the clerks began stacking the day's petitions into wooden shelves. The fragrance of ink and paper filled the room, mingling with the faint trace of smoke that lingered in the air. It was a small reminder of something just beyond their awareness, something that would slowly, silently grow in significance over the years to come. In the town beyond the walls, shopkeepers were closing their shutters for the night. The smell of soy broth and steamed rice still hung in the streets. A group of laborers walked past the riverbank, their conversation low and steady, speaking of family matters and tomorrow's work. Life continued in its peaceful rhythm, calm and ordinary. And somewhere in a fisherman's hut near the docks, another man, unknowingly following the same path as the official in the yamen, lit a small pipe of foreign smoke to ease the soreness in his shoulders. He inhaled gently, the way he had seen others do, unaware that he was participating in a much larger story that had yet to unfold. The empire remained quiet under the spread of the evening sky. The stars began to appear, faint and scattered, their light cool against the rising moon. The mysteries of the future remained hidden, wrapped in the gentle hush of the night, while the first shadows of opium drifted almost invisibly across the land. The morning light fell softly across the rooftops of the riverside town. Thin threads of mist rose from the wet cobblestones, carrying the cool scent of the river upstream. For most families in the Qing Dynasty heartland, dawn began with the same choreography that had played out for generations. The grinding of grain, the washing of rice, the creaking of wooden doors as they slid open to greet the new day. Inside a modest courtyard home, the Chen family stirred awake. Their residence was neither poor nor wealthy, simply an ordinary household with clay walls the color of dried earth, a tiled roof darkened by age, and a mulberry tree that stretched its branches over the yard like a quiet guardian. The leaves shimmered faintly with dew, turning the space into a small oasis of green. Madame Chen moved through the courtyard with practiced calm. She lifted a clay pot from a hook and carried it to the hearth, her footsteps soft on the worn stone. The fire crackled into life, casting warm light on her face. She murmured to herself, reciting the day's tasks as though reading from a familiar scroll. Wash the laundry, prepare vegetables to dry, mend the lining of her husband's outer robe. Her husband, Chen Yuting, emerged a little later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was a man in his early 40s, with a gentle expression and the sturdy hands of someone accustomed to work. He had once been energetic in the mornings, quick to step into the day, humming an old folk tune as he prepared his fishing gear. But in recent months, his body had grown slower, as though wrapped in an invisible weight. No one in the household spoke openly about the small, lacquered box he kept in the inner room. To the children, it was simply where he stored his herbal compresses and ointments for his aching knees. But his wife knew the truth, spoken only once in a whisper months ago. A neighbor had gifted him a small supply of foreign smoke, claiming it would ease the lingering pain from years of night fishing on cold waters. "It helps me sleep," he had said quietly, "and it helps me wake without stiffness." At first, she believed him. He worked with steady hands each morning, mended his nets, and brought home enough fish to support the household. There was nothing unusual to see. But over time, she began to notice small changes, barely visible, like faint ripples in a still pond. He lingered longer in bed before rising. He paused more often while repairing his nets, staring into the river as though listening for something not quite present. When he laughed, it sounded softer, slower, as if his joy required a moment of effort to surface. Still, these changes were subtle. He remained a good father, a helpful husband, and a hard-working fisherman. Nothing seemed alarming enough to raise concern. On this morning, he sat down at the low wooden table as his wife served congee sprinkled with chopped spring onions. The children, still drowsy, took their places on mats beside him, rubbing their eyes and leaning against each other. The room filled with the warm aroma of steamed rice and the faint, earthy scent of bamboo mats. The family ate quietly, as most families did. Outside, faint sounds drifted through the narrow alley, neighbors drawing water from clay jars, roosters crowing, the slow clatter of a cart rolling toward the marketplace. Life, in its simplest form, continued exactly as it always had. After breakfast, Chen Yuting returned to the inner room. He slid open the small wooden chest with a soft creak. Inside lay the thin pipe, the small resinous lump wrapped in cloth, and a tiny oil lamp used for heating. The ritual had become familiar, woven gently into the fabric of his mornings. He hesitated, glancing at the doorway to ensure his children remained in the courtyard. His conscience was not troubled. He believed he was doing nothing harmful. The neighbor who introduced him to the substance used it only occasionally. Several boatmen at the docks used it too, claiming it softened the aches of rowing and hauling rope. Even a traveling scholar passing through the town had mentioned that opium was becoming a fashionable indulgence in certain circles. Chen Yuting lit the lamp. The flame flickered, casting faint shadows on the clay wall. He carefully warmed the opium, shaping it with the metal tool the neighbor had given him. When he drew the smoke into his lungs, the warmth spread through him with gentle ease, dissolving the stiffness in his joints and the dull ache behind his shoulders. For a moment, he closed his eyes. There was no sense of euphoria, no rush of unnatural pleasure, only stillness, a softened world, a quiet respite from the river wind that had shaped his life for decades. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke unfurl like a drifting cloud. The moment passed, and he extinguished the lamp, storing everything back in the chest with methodical care. He washed his hands at the basin, inhaled fresh morning air, and stepped into the courtyard to begin the day's work. To an outside observer, nothing seemed unusual. But for his wife, the subtle shift was unmistakable. His steps were steadier than a moment ago, his face more relaxed, his eyes slightly distant, yet serene. She said nothing, not out of fear or resignation, but simply because the change did not yet feel threatening. Many men used foreign smoke now. Many neighbors spoke of its benefits in small, casual conversations, and the empire, immense and old, showed no sign of worry. Later that morning, Chen Yuting made his way toward the docks. The sky was pale blue, washed clean by the cool river breeze. Boats bobbed gently against their ropes, and fishermen called out greetings to one another. The scent of wet wood and salt drifted over the water. A few men stood gathered near the shade of a storage shed, whispering with mild excitement. Rumor had it that a new shipment of foreign goods had arrived overnight. Strange fabrics from distant lands, delicate porcelain with unfamiliar designs, and perhaps, some said, a fresh supply of opium resin. Nothing official, of course. The overseer maintained that foreign smoke was regulated. But regulations in port towns often softened when profits appeared. Chen Yuting approached the group with quiet curiosity, though he did not linger. He had nets to repair, ropes to coil, bait to prepare. His life remained anchored in steady routine, but the whispers stayed with him, tiny threads of intrigue, weaving themselves into the quiet space of his thoughts. Meanwhile, back in the Chen household, his wife prepared vegetables on a wooden cutting board. She paused occasionally, glancing toward the gate with a faint expression of concern she could not fully name. She wiped her hands on her apron and continued her work, trying to push away the lingering question that had begun forming in her mind. When did this new substance become a part of their daily life? And how quietly would it continue to grow within their home? The sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the mulberry leaves in the courtyard. The house looked peaceful, unchanged, serene, timeless. Yet something delicate had shifted, like the first faint crack in a vessel that still holds water perfectly well. A change so small it could be dismissed, a change so gentle it could be forgotten by noon. And yet, undeniably, a change. The river glimmered beneath the noon sun, its surface broken only by the rhythm of oars and the occasional glint of a fish leaping near the bank. The docks were alive in their usual way, never hurried, never chaotic, but filled with the calm motion of people who knew these waters deeply. Fishermen, boatmen, porters, and traders all moved with a shared understanding of the river's pace. Nothing here was fast, nothing needed to be. Chen Yuting settled near the bow of his small boat and began repairing a tear in one of his nets. The twine was coarse beneath his fingers, still damp from the morning dew. He worked patiently, threading and knotting with a familiar rhythm that soothed the mind. Around him, the sounds of the river formed a gentle chorus, creaking wood, soft splashes, and distant calls of vendors selling steamed buns from a nearby stall. Across the dock, a small group of men had formed a loose circle in the shade of a canvas awning. They laughed quietly, exchanging bamboo pipes and stories from the previous night's catch. The smell of opium drifted faintly from the group, blending with the scent of fish, rope, and tar. It was subtle, a sweetness beneath the stronger smells of the waterfront, easy to ignore if one chose to. These men were neither wealthy nor poor. They were simply part of the river's daily machinery. Yet more and more, they carried the soft, relaxed aura of opium users. Eyes slightly unfocused, movements just a shade slower than before, voices smooth and drifting like the current. One of them, an older boatman named Uncle Zhu, waved to Yu Ting. "Come, sit a moment," he called, his voice warm and friendly. "Share a pipe. It clears the mind." Chen Yu Ting smiled politely but shook his head. "Another time, perhaps. I've nets to finish." The men chuckled softly, accepting his refusal without disappointment. They continued their conversation, voices floating through the warm afternoon air. Though he did not join them, Yu Ting felt the familiar pull of curiosity, gentle, steady, not urgent. It was the same feeling he experienced each morning in his inner room, that subtle anticipation of a moment's warmth and stillness. He returned to his work but found his thoughts drifting. The men under the awning were good workers, capable, reliable, strong. Yet something about them had changed. Their laughter lasted a little longer than before. Their tasks took a bit more time. They rested more often in the afternoons, leaning against the dock posts with eyes half closed, as though the world itself had become softer and less demanding. It was not alarming, not yet. If anything, it made them seem more content. But deep within his chest, Yu Ting felt a faint tremor of recognition. The same slow pull toward softness, the same tendency to linger in moments that once passed quickly. He tied another knot in his net and set it aside to dry. Nearby, a merchant barge had arrived from a southern port. Laborers carried crates along the gangplank, tea, ceramics, woven mats, and other ordinary goods. Yet at the very bottom of the stack, hidden beneath layers of fabric, were several small wooden boxes, tightly sealed with wax. The dockmaster glanced at them only briefly, recording the shipment with the indifference of someone who had seen this 100 times before. No one spoke of what rested inside the smaller crates, but everyone knew. This was the new rhythm of trade, quiet, discreet, profitable. As the sun began its slow descent, casting warm orange light across the river, Yu Ting finished his repairs and leaned against the side of the boat. He looked toward the fishermen still gathered under the awning. The group was larger now, 5 or 6 men, some passing a pipe between them, others simply watching the smoke rise in thin, curling threads. One of them, a younger man with sun-browned skin, inhaled deeply, held the smoke in his chest, and exhaled with a long, wistful sigh. For a moment, his gaze drifted across the river as if following something only he could see. Then he closed his eyes and leaned back against the wooden post. Yu Ting wondered what the young man felt in that moment. Ease? Relief? Escape? He could not name the sensation fully, but he knew it. He had felt it himself earlier that morning, the melting away of tension, the gentle quiet that settled in the mind like dust settling on a still surface. He understood why the young man sought it. He understood why the older man did, too. Life along the river was steady but unforgiving. Cold mornings, heavy nets, long hours, joints worn by decades of labor. A moment of warmth was not a luxury. It was a reprieve. And so, he did not judge them. Later in the afternoon, Yu Ting carried his repaired nets home. The streets were calm, shaded by rows of willows that leaned gracefully over the canal. The sound of cicadas filled the air with their steady, rhythmic hum. Vendors chatted with customers, children played near the riverbank, and the scent of simmering broth drifted from open doorways. It was difficult to imagine that anything troublesome could lurk beneath such peaceful routines. When he entered the courtyard, his wife looked up from washing laundry. She noticed the relaxed slump in his shoulders, the faint softness in his eyes. They were not signs of exhaustion. They were signs of something else. Something she now recognized as part of his growing morning ritual.
"Did you have a busy day at the docks?"
She asked. "Busy enough," he answered gently. She rinsed a cloth, wrung out the water, and draped it over a bamboo pole to dry.
"The butcher came earlier," she said. "He said fresh pork will be available tomorrow morning."
He nodded. "Then I will wake early." She studied him for a moment longer, though her expression remained calm. She did not press him with questions. She did not mention the faint scent of resin she sometimes smelled on his clothes. Instead, she simply said, "Dinner will be ready soon," and returned to her tasks. Their lives, on the surface, continued exactly as before. Meals were shared, clothes were mended, the children played in the yard, the mulberry tree rustled softly in the evening breeze. And yet, beneath the quiet normalcy, a small shift deepened, subtle, steady, unspoken. Like silt slowly accumulating at the bottom of a river, it changed the current without drawing attention. That night, after the children fell asleep, Yu Ting sat on a wooden stool near the doorway. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light through the leaves of the mulberry tree. He listened to the quiet sounds of the house, the crackle of cooling clay tiles, the sigh of wind slipping past the courtyard walls. He thought of the men under the awning. He thought of the gentle warmth that filled his chest each morning. And he thought of how easily he could lean into that softness again tomorrow. The night deepened, and he closed his eyes. The river flowed quietly in the distance, steady and unchanging. But the world within the Chen household had shifted, ever so slightly, toward something new. As the years deepened into the early 19th century, the empire continued to move forward with a type of inertia, neither prospering nor collapsing, simply drifting in a long exhale. In the small farm villages, in the alleys behind city gates, in the river ports where boats slept side by side like dark water lilies, the changes were not violent. They were subtle. A quiet erosion, as gentle as mist settling on roof tiles at dawn. People still woke before the sun. They still warmed their hands over clay stoves. They still knotted their hair, washed their faces with cold water, and stepped into their daily routines as though nothing around them was changing. And on the surface, it hadn't. But beneath that stillness, something essential was loosening, like the first threads pulling free from a silk sleeve. The Qing Dynasty, once defined by confidence and ritual and the weight of tradition, was beginning to feel strangely hollow, though few could articulate why. The court believed everything was in order. The scholars believed that moral cultivation would fix every problem. The magistrates believed that discipline and punishments would maintain harmony. And ordinary people believed, well, they believed little at all. Belief itself was thinning. The empire remained vast and visually impressive, but its spirit, its inner breath, felt as though it were being gently exhaled into the night. In a narrow courtyard home in Shandong, a scholar named Xu Huiwen sat before his desk every morning. He had once been so diligent that the neighbors called him the lamp that never sleeps. But now, at the age of 53, he found himself spending more time staring at the paper than writing on it. His inkstone had dried a little around the edges. His brush had stiffened, and his mind, which once felt fresh and fluid, now drifted like an old boat whose oars had been misplaced. He knew the classics by heart. He could recite the Book of Rites backwards if he wished, but the words no longer stirred anything inside him. They felt like old furniture passed down through too many generations, useful, respected, but stripped of meaning. His son asked him once, "Father, do you think I should pursue the exams?" Hui Wen did not answer immediately. He watched the courtyard well, heard the creaking of the pulley rope as a neighbor drew water. The sound echoed strangely in the still morning air.
At last he said, "You may pursue them, but do not pursue them with your heart." It was an unusual answer, and yet deeply honest. The scholar could no longer pretend that the examination system still held power, or righteousness, or even purpose. It was a ladder leaning against a crumbling wall. Hui Wen remained dutiful. He still copied passages, occasionally. He still bowed before his ancestral tablets. He still held his posture straight. But a quiet emptiness had settled in him, like dust on lacquer. He was not alone. Across the empire, thousands of scholars were experiencing the same gentle fading of conviction. And when the literati lose their faith, the empire's foundation loses its firmness. Nothing dramatic happened. No protests, no upheavals. Just men sitting at desks, feeling a slow, soft doubt seep into their bones.
Far south, in a busy river port, a merchant named Lin Fei stood on a wooden dock during the late afternoon. The Pearl River flowed past, quiet and wide, its surface rippling like silk under a painter's brush. In the distance, foreign ships hovered. Some were tall and rigid like strange guardian spirits, others low and broad like floating warehouses. Lin Fei had been trading tea and porcelain for nearly 20 years. He knew the smell of river humidity better than any perfume. He knew the sound of cargo being lifted, the fatigue of bargaining in crowded markets, the taste of cheap rice wine that softened long days. But recently, he had started to notice something unsettling. The river was growing quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the quiet of shift, of transition, of subtle imbalance. Certain ships carried boxes with no markings, guarded too carefully, exchanged too quickly. The officials who inspected them were oddly indifferent, barely glancing, barely lifting a hand. The harbor, once filled with bargaining cries, now seemed filled with murmurs instead. One evening, Lin Fei asked an older boatman, "Do you feel that something is changing?" The boatman shrugged. "The river always changes. We only notice when it's too late." Lin Fei nodded, though the answer bothered him. He felt something unnatural moving beneath the surface of commerce, a new kind of wealth, a new kind of secrecy. He could not see the opium directly, but he could sense its presence like a shadow at the edge of the lamplight. The river kept flowing, quietly, patiently, and with each tide, it brought in a substance that would reshape the fate of the empire. In the Central Plains, a farmer named Gao Ming stood on a ridge overlooking his small patch of land. His crops were modest: millet, beans, a few vegetables, and the earth beneath his feet was cracked from the early summer heat. He rubbed the dirt between his fingers. It felt lighter than usual, lacking nutrition, lacking the softness that indicated healthy soil. "Another year like this," he murmured, "and we will have to borrow grain." Borrowing grain meant debt. Debt meant dependence. Dependence meant instability. and instability, when spread across thousands of villages, meant trouble for the empire. Yet Gao Ming, like many farmers, did not blame the heavens or the emperor or fate. He only sighed and returned to his work. The sound of his hoe striking the earth echoed faintly across the hills, like a lonely heartbeat.
Around him, other fields lay empty, not because of famine, not because of disaster, but because many young men had left to seek work elsewhere. The countryside was thinning as surely as the scholar's ink and the merchant's confidence. The empire looked stable from afar, but up close, in places like Gao Ming's village, small fractures were quietly multiplying.
When an empire begins to decline, people often imagine grand battles, dramatic betrayals, or catastrophic failures. But in reality, decay more often begins with small, almost invisible shifts. 100,000 minor imbalances accumulating slowly, quietly, like grains of sand slipping through fingers. In the Qing Dynasty, the erosion took many forms. A scholar who wrote less each year, a merchant who felt subtle tension beneath the surface of trade, a farmer who watched the soil grow tired, a magistrate who sighed more often than he smiled, a soldier who sharpened his spear out of habit, not duty, a craftsman who sold fewer goods and spoke fewer words, a child who asked fewer questions and slept uneasily. None of these seemed serious in isolation, but together they formed a gentle, pervasive heaviness that settled over the land like gray mist. And into this heaviness, opium would find an easy home. Not yet, not loudly, not dramatically, but the foundation was already softened, like old wood exposed to years of humidity. The empire did not know it was vulnerable, but vulnerability is rarely recognized from within. As evening fell across the empire, life continued with deceptive serenity. Oil lamps flickered in scholar courtyards. The river glowed with reflections of lanterns tied to mastheads. Village homes exhaled the smell of congee and cooked greens. Children chased fireflies in dusty alleyways. Wind moved through bamboo forests with soft, whispering breaths. China looked peaceful, beautiful even, an empire at rest. And yet, in a handful of private rooms, especially near the coast, a few men inhaled a sweet, rich smoke and leaned back with half-closed eyes. The opium was still small in scale, still a trivial curiosity, still considered harmless. But its smoke curled slowly upward like a serpent waking from a long sleep. That faint, fragrant ribbon would eventually become a cloud, and that cloud would grow into a storm that the Qing Dynasty could not dispel. But for now, it was only the first breath, the first whisper, the first shadow drifting across a civilization that still believed itself whole. Thus ended this early stage of quiet erosion, a period when the empire shifted not through dramatic events, but through softness, tiredness, and the delicate unraveling of its inner threads. The people continued their lives, unaware that the smallest of substances, the faintest smoke, would soon intertwine with these existing weaknesses and reshape the future. Opium did not destroy the Qing alone. It arrived like a feather on a scale that was already tipping. Chapter 5 marks the moment when the scale began to move.
By the 1820s, the empire was still outwardly calm. Mountains stood unmoved. The great rivers followed their ancient courses, and villages continued to glow with evening firelight. But hidden within this tranquility, a subtle new rhythm had begun to pulse through certain streets, certain alleys,
and certain unremarkable houses where curtains were drawn earlier than usual. These were not yet the infamous opium dens of later decades. They were smaller, quieter, gentler. Rooms borrowed in the back of tea houses, chambers above warehouses, corners of private homes. No signs, no crowds, no drama, just a faint sweetness in the air, like incense that has drifted a little too far from its burner.
At night, when most families prepared to sleep, small groups of men would slip into these quiet rooms. Not addicts, at least not yet. Merely curious souls. Merchants with restless minds. Minor officials weary of bureaucratic repetition. Scholars who had grown tired of memorized lines. Laborers seeking something warm to soften the ache of long days. They came not out of desperation, but out of gentle exhaustion. And behind those closed doors, the lamps would be lit, soft, amber, trembling, and the world outside would slowly fade away. Inside these rooms, the first thing one noticed was the stillness. Not tension, not secrecy, only a warm hush. The kind of quiet found in deep libraries or in the spaces between falling snowflakes. The second thing was the smell. Opium smoke carried a sweetness unlike anything else in China. Not floral, not herbal. Something darker, richer, like roasted honey blended with distant spices. It drifted slowly, lazily, curling upward in delicate ribbons. Nothing sharp, nothing overwhelming. Just a gentle veil that softened lamps, softened faces, softened thoughts. A merchant might take his first inhalation and feel the weight in his shoulders ease, as though he had set down a heavy package. A clerk might forget the day's paperwork. A scholar might forget the anxieties of the examination. A soldier might forget the loneliness of distant postings. Not bliss, not ecstasy, just forgetting. A temporary gentleness wrapped in smoke. Their eyes would half close, their limbs would loosen, their voices would quiet into murmurs barely above breath. And in that haze, time itself seemed to unspool, like silk thread unwinding from a spool in slow motion. This was the beginning of addiction, yet none of them recognized it. The feeling was too soft, too comforting, too ordinary. The danger was in the fact that it did not feel dangerous at all. In a small room above a modest riverside tea house in Canton, a young scholar named Chen Rong sat cross-legged before a low lacquered table. He had been persuaded by a friend, another scholar, slightly older, slightly jaded, to try opium for the first time. The room was simple. Wooden beams overhead, a single hanging lantern, a bamboo mat beneath their feet. Outside, the murmur of the river drifted through the thin walls like a lullaby. Chen watched his friend heat the dark opium paste in a tiny spoon over a candle flame. It bubbled softly, emitting a fragrance that felt strangely calming even before he inhaled it. "Just one breath," his friend said, smiling gently. "Enough to soften the mind, not enough to trouble it." Chen believed him. Why wouldn't he? The friend looked relaxed, articulate, entirely in control. The scholar lifted the pipe. The smoke touched his tongue like warm syrup. It slid down his throat with unexpected smoothness. And then, slowly, it entered his lungs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the edges of the room softened. The lantern light grew warmer, and a gentle heaviness settled into his limbs. Not fatigue, but a velvety calm, as though he were being wrapped in a thick blanket on a winter night. His mind quieted,
His worries dissolved like ink in water. He felt neither joy nor sadness, just deep, profound ease. He smiled faintly. His friend smiled back. Neither of them spoke for nearly half an hour. There was nothing to say. When Chen finally left the tea house that night, the river breeze felt colder than usual. He pulled his robe tighter around him and walked home slowly, the world feeling strangely distant, as if viewed from behind a thin layer of glass. He did not realize that this glass would thicken with every visit. Across the empire, in a small administrative town near Suzhou, a minor Qing official named Li An sat alone in a borrowed room above an apothecary. The day had been long, Peters clamoring for attention, tax disputes, endless reports, accusations of small thefts, requests for permissions, demands for audits. He felt drained in a way that tea could not fix. He had discovered opium only a few months earlier, introduced by a colleague who complained constantly about headaches that no physician could cure. Li An lit a lamp. Its flame took a moment to catch, flickering weakly before settling into a steady glow. He sat with a long, thin pipe in his hands and inhaled slowly. The effect was always the same. His breath deepened. His shoulders loosened. The exhaustion behind his eyes melted. And most importantly, the world's noise faded. For the first time that day, he could think without thinking, feel without feeling, be without being burdened. He told himself he deserved this rest. Just a little relief, just a small kindness to himself. He did not consider what it might cost him in the months ahead. He did not consider that he was returning to this room more and more often. He only sat still, letting the smoke fill the small space like a soft gray fog, and listened to the faint hum of crickets outside. The empire might have been trembling at its edges, but inside this room, all was hushed and forgiving. In inland towns and coastal cities alike, another new pattern was forming. Men would slip into these quiet rooms after sundown and emerge long after midnight. Some returned home with their robes slightly smoky, though their families rarely questioned the scent. After all, many tea houses burned aromatic wood or incense at night. Women noticed the subtle changes first. Husbands who once returned stressed now returned silent. Fathers who once told stories now seemed too calm, too distant. Sons who once studied late into the night now slept too deeply, with breaths heavier than before. But none of these things seemed alarming. In a world filled with fatigue, a little quiet was welcomed. A little softness in a man was seen as a sign of maturity. Only later would they realize what kind of softness it was. For now, families simply assumed that their men were tired, relaxing, aging, calming. Even the addicts themselves thought the same. Addiction does not arrive with a roar. It arrives on padded feet, like a cat stepping across tatami. It enters the body quietly, patiently, politely. And the Qing Dynasty, with its gentle decay and its unspoken exhaustion, offered fertile soil for such a visitor. The dens grew slowly. The visitors increased gradually. The smoke drifted invisibly through society like morning mist through bamboo. No alarms, no panic, just a quiet, spreading fog. By the end of the decade, the empire had thousands of men who believed. They were not addicted. They were simply resting.
They could stop any time. They were in control. And at first, this was almost true. Opium's earliest users were not starving beggars or reckless youths. They were educated men, hard-working men, respectable men. Men who felt they were managing stress, not creating dependence. But every pipe left a small imprint. Every evening visit left a small craving. Every inhalation left a small emptiness when it faded. The body learned the rhythm slowly. The mind adapted without warning. The spirit softened. Addiction was not yet a chain. It was a silken thread, thin, light, easily dismissed. But thread by thread, evening by evening, breath by breath, those silken threads would one day become ropes. Not yet. For now, the empire slept peacefully, unaware that in hundreds of quiet rooms, its future was being rewritten in soft curls of gray smoke.
Opium did not sweep through China like a storm. It drifted, slowly and quietly, like fog rolling in from a distant sea. It began at the ports, Canton, Macau, Fujian, where foreign traders whispered and half-learned Chinese, where cargo changed hands under the glow of lanterns, where curious minds met curious goods. But after the first curious smokers inhaled their first soft breaths, the influence did not remain on the coast. It traveled inland by the simplest of pathways, merchants returning home, scholars visiting relatives, government clerks reassigned to new districts, boatmen traveling the river routes, soldiers rotated between posts. Not evangelizing, not recruiting, simply carrying habits with them, like scents on their robes.
A scholar who smoked in Canton might share a pipe with a cousin in Hunan. A merchant from Guangdong might introduce it to a business partner in Jiangxi while closing a tea deal. A soldier, home for the winter, might inhale beside childhood friends who asked only out of curiosity. It spread not by intention, but by human nature, a desire to rest, to soften, to forget. The Qing Dynasty had many defenses against armies, against rebellions, even against drought. But it had no defense against weariness. And opium offered relief to the weary in a way that felt gentle, almost compassionate. One of the quietest highways for opium's spread was the Grand Canal, that centuries-old ribbon of water binding north and south. Along its banks stood markets, bamboo warehouses, and river inns where travelers rested before continuing their journey. Boatmen along the canal lived lives of repetition, hauling goods, pushing long poles into riverbeds, tying knots that their fathers and grandfathers had tied in exactly the same way. Their backs bent early in life, their hands thickened into calluses. Their days blended into one another like ripples merging on the canal's surface. And so, when a few of them were introduced to opium by merchants traveling north from Canton, they accepted it without suspicion. They sought no intoxication. They only wanted warmth in their tired limbs. A single pipe at the end of a long day. A moment of stillness in the low-lit rooms of river inns. Soft conversation, soft laughter, soft drifting thoughts. Soon, river inns became some of the first inland places quietly touched by opium. Not dens, not brothels, just simple, worn-down lodgings where men gathered around a stove on cold nights. There, the smoke curled upward like ghostly silk, unnoticed by innkeepers and unremarked upon by travelers. It was seen as a harmless habit, no more concerning than wine, no more indulgent than tea. But boatmen were great carriers of culture.
They traveled more than most. They connected towns, districts, provinces. When they adopted a habit, it rarely stayed with them alone. And so the smoke traveled northward, one breath at a time. Another quiet cradle for opium spread was the tea house, the lungs of Chinese social life. Inland tea houses were never hurried places. Men lingered there for hours, discussing local gossip, the weather, poetry, or nothing at all. Tea house keepers valued calmness, the flow of conversation as steady as the pouring of tea. At first, opium appeared only in secret rooms behind the main hall, small chambers used for private conversation or for scholars reviewing their notes in solitude. The tea house owner might pretend not to notice a merchant heating a pipe, might look away when a traveler pulled a small black lump from his pocket. It was not a matter of approval. It was a matter of not wishing to disturb anyone's comfort. And in a culture where causing discomfort was impolite, silence became a gentle accomplice. One afternoon, in a tea house in Anhui, a scholar and a merchant shared a pipe between them. A young waiter passed by, catching a faint drift of sweet smoke. He paused for a moment, confused, not displeased, just curious. "What is that scent?" he asked softly. The men looked at each other and smiled. "Medicine," the merchant said kindly. "A little warmth for cold days." The waiter nodded, accepting the explanation without question. It did smell warm. It did feel calming. How could such a fragrance be dangerous? In this way, opium's aura remained gentle, even benevolent. The world saw its softness, not its cost, its sweetness, not its shadow. And tea houses became quiet gateways where curiosity was first sparked. Opium did not enter first into the homes of the poor. It entered into the homes of the comfortable but tired, minor officials, skilled artisans, merchants of modest means, aging scholars, men with responsibilities that pressed lightly but steadily upon their daily lives. These men did not seek escape. They sought ease. A pipe after supper, a pipe before bed, a pipe to accompany a conversation with a trusted friend. Often it was introduced politely. "Would you like to try?" Just once, to soften the mind. It will help you sleep. And the first time, it often did help. Sleep came easily. Dreams were gentle. Morning arrived without the sharp edge of lingering thoughts. A pipe became medicine. Medicine became habit. Habit became routine. A routine that felt harmless, like tying one's belt or lighting incense at the ancestral altar. Even wives did not worry. They saw their husbands more relaxed, less irritated, less burdened. "He is working too hard," they said. "A little rest will help him." They did not know that this rest had a cost that accumulated quietly, a cost that no one could yet see. More than trade, more than smuggling routes, more than profit, opium spread through the simplest of human networks, friendship. One friend sharing a pipe with another, two cousins passing an evening together, a clerk and a scholar meeting after work, a merchant and a host sealing a business deal. No one preached its virtues. No one advertised it. No one forced it. Opium spread because it was offered with kindness, and few things are more persuasive than kindness. A moment of shared rest, a moment of shared vulnerability, a moment of letting one's guard down. That was all it took. Soon, in many villages, it was whispered softly. Have you tried the southern smoke? It is good for sleep, good for easing the chest, good for calming the mind. Only later would people add, and difficult to stop. But in these early years, no such caution existed. The smoke was too gentle, too quiet, too polite. It entered homes like a guest. It remained like a companion. And it settled like a shadow that dimmed the lamp only slightly. If one looked closely, the earliest signs were already visible in these inland towns. A merchant who visited the tea house more frequently than before. A scholar whose pipe collection quietly grew. A minor official who seemed a little more detached, a little slower to respond. A young man whose sleep felt incomplete without the soft haze preceding it. But because the signs were small, and because the empire itself was drifting into a habit of quiet fatigue, nothing felt alarming. A sigh here, a late morning there, a few coins spent on a new indulgence, they all blended into the rhythm of daily life. And so the spread continued, not in waves, but in whispers. No one in the Qing court knew it yet. No official in Beijing had marked the change. No edict had been written, no warning delivered. But by the late 1820s, something essential had already shifted. Opium was no longer a coastal curiosity. It was becoming a part of inland culture. Not dominant, not alarming, just present. Present in river inns, present in tea houses, present in homes, present in friendship, present in the soft spaces of life that the state never touched. It was beginning to weave itself into the empire's fabric. One quiet room, one pipe, one breath at a time. The spread was not dramatic. It was not visible on maps. But from a historian's lens, or from the lens of hindsight, this was the moment when the shadow that began at the coast started to extend its fingers toward the heart of China. And it did so gently, almost tenderly, like a lullaby that slowly becomes too comforting to resist. The rumor that began in tea stalls eventually seeped into the corridors of county granaries and tax offices. Silver was becoming restless, not vanishing entirely, not yet, just slower to appear, harder to collect, less willing to fill the bowls and boxes it had once flowed into with such confidence. For most officials, this did not begin as a crisis at all. It was a whisper, unremarkable, almost delicate. A clerk noticed that this year's spring receipts were a finger's breadth lower than expected. A grain accountant observed that villagers asked for slightly more time to pay. A salt inspector noted that merchants who normally paid with polished ingots had begun offering coins of mixed alloy instead. Individually, none of these signs meant anything. Together, though few could see the pattern yet, they formed the first quiet tremor of what would become a national quake. And far from the capital, in towns barely marked on maps, people felt it first.
In a county nestled between wet paddies and bamboo forests, Magistrate Wen Shuyi sat alone in his office as dusk settled around him. The lamplight flickered over stacks of ledgers, neatly kept, though the numbers inside had begun to stretch in ways he did not like. He ran a slow finger down the columns. His expression was calm, but his worry pressed gently behind his ribs. The harvest had been decent. The village heads had seemed cooperative enough. Yet somehow, the silver collected in taxes felt thinner,
as though someone had ladled a bowl and found less soup than expected. He leaned back, listening to the murmuring of autumn insects through the open window. A thought came to him slowly, like a boat drifting toward a pier. It is not that silver has disappeared. It is that silver has changed hands. Merchants passing through his county now carried strange chests, not of domestic goods, but of colorful cloth bundles filled with resinous, dark brown bricks.
Opium bricks. They traded them quietly, almost respectfully, with farmers who sold a handful of their stored grain or exchanged pawned trinkets from better days. And with each exchange, a little silver left the county, not stolen, not seized, but traded willingly. A gentle leak in a wooden bucket that still looked full. Magistrate Wen closed the ledger and sighed. He knew he could not report this. The imperial court preferred numbers, not doubts. Beijing liked problems that fit in neat boxes, not ones that seeped through the cracks in silence. So he extinguished the lamp, stepped outside, and told himself what many officials across the empire now whispered. Perhaps it will balance out next year. Far from magistrate halls, silver moved with its own peculiar rhythm. The Qing taxation system relied on it, depended on it, like a body depends on blood. Grain could be grown anywhere, labor could be commanded, but taxes? Those required silver, and increasingly, that silver drained toward the ports where British opium ships waited. Yet for ordinary villagers, none of this was visible. What they saw was different, the subtle shifts in daily life that hinted something was changing beneath the surface. At a small village market, an elderly woman selling tofu noticed that fewer customers paid with the usual heavy ingots. Instead, they handed her coin strings, lighter, easier to fake, and less valuable. One man apologized as he purchased a block of tofu. "The silver is with my brother," he said. "He's trading with the foreigners again. Their goods, well, people say they bring good dreams." He said the last part softly, embarrassed. The elderly woman nodded slowly, though she understood far more than she wanted to. She had seen the good dream smoke curling out of the old schoolhouse where several men, fathers, normally hard-working, sat in the afternoons, drifting like lotus seeds across water. Silver did not simply flow out of the county. It pooled in the corners where smoke curled through doorways. It disappeared into the hands of foreign merchants who gave nothing but a temporary fog in return. And as silver trickled away, prices shifted, only a little at first. Rice cost 1 more coin. Salt cost 2. A simple wooden bucket now required the same amount of copper as a chicken had once cost. In the cities, the rich complained very little. Silver had ways of staying with them. It was the villages that felt the hollowness first, quietly, without rebellion, as though this too was part of the cycle of seasons. In the capital, it took much longer for anyone to notice. The Forbidden City was insulated by its own rituals, morning court sessions, memorial scrolls, and the clicking of ceremonial tiles beneath the boots of imperial guards. When a memorial finally arrived warning that silver was behaving strangely, it was read by an exhausted Ministry of Revenue secretary who skimmed the contents, sighed, and placed it in a lacquered box with similar reports. He rubbed his temples. Another note. Another magistrate worried about numbers. The capital observed such things through a lens thick with bureaucracy. The empire had endured famines, rebellions, plagues. How could silver, an inert metal, be worth attention? And yet, in the evenings, behind the sealed doors of the ministry, treasurers began to whisper. The warehouses, they feel emptier this season.
Have the tax rates dropped? No, but the payments are fewer. Where is the silver going?
No one answered, but too many knew the truth to speak it aloud. To admit that opium was draining the empire's financial lifeblood was to admit that foreign merchants, not armies, not traitors, were quietly eating away at the foundation stones of the dynasty. And so Beijing did what governments throughout history often do when confronted with a silent crisis. It waited. In a quiet town along the Yangtze, a family of rice traders kept meticulous records, neatly bound in string-tied notebooks, each page filled with brushstrokes as elegant as poetry. The eldest son, Li Xin, noticed something odd one spring. "Father," he said one evening, "our profits are the same, but the silver is less." His father did not look up from his writing. "That is not possible." Shen's voice remained gentle, respectful. "But the accounts show it." His father dipped his brush into ink and drew a final character before closing the book. Then he exhaled through his nose in the long, tired way of men who have lived many seasons. "Do you know why merchants smoke the foreign poppy resin?" he asked quietly. Shen hesitated. "I have heard that it calms the heart." His father snorted softly, neither amused nor dismissive, simply weary. "It calms the heart by emptying the hand." He rose, walked to a chest, and unlocked it. Inside lay stacks of silver ingots, less than last year, noticeably so. "We have not spent more," his father said. "We have not bought new boats. We have not lost shipments. And yet, see?" His fingers hovered above the diminished stacks. "Some of our buyers are paying in opium instead of money," he said. "They say it is worth more in the city." His voice turned quiet. "I never thought I would see the day when the world measured grain against smoke." The two men stood there silently, the lantern flame trembling. Outside, the river lapped softly against the wooden embankments, indifferent to human worries. Silver was slipping away, not in handfuls, but in habits, in temptation, in exchanges whispered behind shops. And while the Li family still survived comfortably, they could not shake the strange, hollow feeling that something integral had changed. Not broken, not yet, just changed in a way that could not be undone. In the city of Suzhou, where canals cut gentle lines across the landscape like veins on a leaf, the silk market bustled as it always had. Merchants unfurled bolts of shimmering fabric, pinks like lotus petals, blues like deep wells, gold threads that glimmered like autumn sunlight. And yet, beneath the beauty, something was different. Buyers who once paid with silver now paid with foreign coins that bore Latin inscriptions. Some paid with opium bricks wrapped in waxed cloth, an unspeakable trade in previous generations. One silk merchant, Lady Duan, refused to touch the foreign resin. When a young buyer offered it to her, she shook her head politely. "We deal in cloth, not clouds," she said. The man hesitated, embarrassed perhaps, but left. Later that afternoon, a rival merchant accepted the same buyer's opium, smiling as though he had secured a prize. Lady Duan watched, expression calm, but eyes troubled. She had lived long enough to understand that markets do not shift overnight unless pushed by something powerful. And as she watched the rival weigh the opium brick on a silver scale, placing it where silver ingots should have been, she felt a chill coil slowly around her spine. The balance was tipping. Not dramatically, not loudly,
just enough to alter the trajectory of a dynasty. By the time the imperial court realized that silver was leaking out of the country, the situation had already changed in ways that could not be reversed. Villagers used more copper and barter. Merchants hoarded silver instead of using it. Banks began charging more for money exchanges. Local governments paid soldiers late or paid them in grain instead of coins. Small shifts, small discomforts. But when multiplied across hundreds of millions of people, those small shifts became a weight the empire could not ignore. It was not yet a crisis, not yet open suffering, not yet famine or rebellion. It was simply imbalance, quiet, creeping, patient, the kind that weakens beams before the roof collapses. And so the Qing Dynasty entered a new stage of decline, unseen by most, unacknowledged by many, but already gathering momentum like a distant storm rolling toward the coast. Opium had not destroyed the empire yet, but it had begun its work in the most effective way possible.
Silently, patiently, through the gentle movement of silver, one ingot at a time, one coin at a time, one habit at a time. By the late 1830s, the Qing Dynasty stood at a strange and dangerous crossroads, one paved not with conquest, but with illusion. On maps, China still looked unbreakable. Its borders stretched from frozen Manchuria to the steaming jungles of the south, from the deserts of Xinjiang to the storm-filled coastline of the eastern seas. More than 400 million people lived beneath the dragon banner. Rice fields shimmered like mirrors beneath the sun. Grand canals still carry grain through ancient arteries carved by forgotten hands. Temples still rang with bells that had echoed for 1,000 years. To the emperor and his court, this still felt like the center of the world. And yet beneath this vast surface, the empire was quietly unraveling. Silver was flowing out faster than it returned. Soldiers were growing thin. Officials grew corrupt. And in the alleyways of every great city, the sweet, bitter smoke of opium curled through open windows like a silent curse.
At first, the Qing court had refused to see it. For years, memorials from provincial governors had warned of addiction, of collapsing productivity, of soldiers selling weapons to finance their next pipe, of families dismantled piece by piece. But Beijing delayed. As long as taxes were paid and rebellions stayed quiet, the dragon slept. Until 1839. That year, the Emperor Daoguang finally accepted what could no longer be denied. China was losing a war without firing a single shot. And so, in a rare act of moral clarity, the emperor chose a man who could not be bought. His name was Lin Zexu.
Lin Zexu was not born powerful. He rose from poverty through the merciless furnace of imperial examinations. A scholar of classical virtue, a man who believed the duty of government was not wealth, but righteousness. He despised corruption. He despised weakness. And above all, he despised opium. When he arrived in Canton, the city that stood at the mouth of China's humiliation, he arrived like a storm. He shut down the opium dens. He arrested dealers without mercy. He pressured local officials into terrified obedience. He cut off food supplies to foreign trading houses. And then he sent a demand that stunned the Western world. Every foreign merchant must surrender all opium immediately. The British traders resisted. This drug was their empire's lifeblood. Opium funded British power in India. It balanced the trade deficit with China.
It paid for tea, silk, and porcelain that fed Europe's appetite. To surrender it was to surrender wealth itself. But Lin Zexu did not negotiate.
He surrounded the foreign warehouses with soldiers, and one by one the chests were delivered. Wooden boxes sealed with iron bands, heavy with poison, labeled in English, marked with the crest of an empire that would soon make war for its return. Over 20,000 chests were dragged to the shoreline, and there, before witnesses from China and the West alike, Lin ordered their destruction. For weeks, the opium was broken open, mixed with lime, dissolved with seawater, flushed into trenches that led out into the ocean. The smoke did not rise that day. Instead, the poison vanished into the sea. Across the empire, word spread like wildfire. For the first time in generations, the Qing state had struck back. Many believed the nightmare was finally ending. They were wrong. He surrounded the foreign warehouses with soldiers, and one by one the chests were delivered. Wooden boxes sealed with iron bands, heavy with poison, labeled in English, marked with the crest of an empire that would soon make war for its return. Over 20,000 chests were dragged to the shoreline, and there, before witnesses from China and the West alike, Lin ordered their destruction. For weeks, the opium was broken open, mixed with lime, dissolved with seawater, flushed into trenches that led out into the ocean. The smoke did not rise that day. Instead, the poison vanished into the sea. Across the empire, word spread like wildfire. For the first time in generations, the Qing state had struck back. Many believed the nightmare was finally ending. They were wrong. In the summer of 1840, dark shapes appeared on the Chinese horizon. They were not like any ships China had seen before. These were steam-powered iron monsters, floating fortresses lined with cannons that could strike from distances the Qing could barely imagine. Their hulls were black, their flags unfamiliar. Their smoke rose not from incense, but from coal-fed engines that pulsed with industrial fury. The Qing Navy moved to intercept them. Wooden war junks, crewed by brave men, armed with cannons that dated back generations. They never stood a chance. British shells tore through the Chinese fleet as if through paper. Ships burned, men drowned. Fort after fort fell. The coast was defenseless. The British did not merely defeat China militarily. They shattered the myth of invincibility that had protected the dynasty for centuries. To the Qing court, this conflict made no sense. How could a distant island nation defeat the Son of Heaven? How could merchants overthrow an empire? They did not understand that this was no longer a war of borders or armies. It was a war between two eras of civilization. China still fought with hand-built cannons and disciplined formations. Britain fought with industrialized weapons, professional navies, and global supply chains. Every battle widened the gap. Chinese fortresses fell in days. British ships sailed upriver unchallenged. Imperial troops fled not from cowardice, but from complete technological inferiority. And yet, within the Forbidden City, confusion reigned. Some officials begged for peace. Others begged for extermination of all foreigners. Few understood the true scale of what they faced. By 1842, the war was over. Not because China had surrendered its will, but because it had lost the ability to resist.
British forces sailed directly toward the heart of China. Nanjing fell under threat of annihilation. The Yangtze River, the ancient spine of the empire, lay open and undefended. The Qing had no choice. They signed.
It was the first of what history would later call the unequal treaties, and it was a disaster beyond measure. China was forced to pay massive silver reparations, open 5 treaty ports to foreign control, grant extraterritorial rights to foreigners, meaning British citizens could not be tried under Chinese law, and worst of all, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever. The treaty did not mention opium by name, but everyone knew the truth. The war had been fought for the drug, and the drug had won. When the British ships finally withdrew, the Qing court told itself that the storm had passed. Trade resumed, ports reopened, foreign flags flew beside imperial banners. Silver once again moved through the markets. But this was not peace. It was submission disguised as stability. Opium did not vanish. It returned in rivers. Now it was protected by treaty, guarded by gunboats, distributed openly, legally, and without shame. The smoke thickened, and the empire, already wounded, began to bleed from the inside. For a brief moment, life seemed to continue as before. Farmers planted their fields. Merchants reopened shops. Scholars returned to their books. But beneath the surface, something had been permanently broken. The Qing Dynasty had lost not just a war. It had lost the belief that it could not lose. The people felt it. The officials feared it. And the foreigners knew it. China had entered a new age. An age not of conquest, but of slow collapse. The First Opium War did not destroy the Qing Dynasty. Not yet. It merely opened the door. A door through which addiction, rebellion, foreign domination, and civil war would soon pour like floodwater into the heart of the empire. The war that should never have been fought had only just begun. When the cannons finally fell silent after the First Opium War, China did not awaken to peace. It awakened to smoke. Not the smoke of burning cities or fallen fortresses, but the slow, curling smoke of a nation learning to forget its own pain. After 1842, opium no longer moved through China in whispers. It moved in daylight. Foreign ships arrived openly at the treaty ports: Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. Their holds were heavy with chests stamped with English markings, iron-banded and sealed with deadly certainty. Unlike before, Qing officials were now powerless to stop them. The treaties had spoken. The cannons had spoken. And the empire had been forced to listen. Where once opium smugglers had crept through river deltas and hidden coves, now merchants unloaded their poison beneath official flags. Warehouses filled. Brokers multiplied. Dens expanded into entire districts. What had once been illegal indulgence became an economic artery. Local governments taxed it. Merchants depended on it. And millions already depended on it to breathe. By the late 1840s, addiction was no longer limited to the margins of society. It climbed every rung of the social ladder. Laborers smoked after 12 hours in the fields, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and hunger. Porters shared pipes in alleyways beneath flickering oil lamps. Boatmen drifted across rivers in slow, half-conscious dreams. In the cities,
Scholars grew pale behind wooden screens. Calligraphy brushes lay abandoned as hands trembled too violently to write. Candidates for the imperial examinations lost years, sometimes entire lives, to the pipe. Even inside the military barracks, the smoke rose. Soldiers who once trained beneath the open sky now leaned against walls, hollow-eyed and unsteady. Muskets were pawned for a few more pellets. Ammunition disappeared. Discipline eroded with every inhale. No decree could reverse it now. The door had been broken open.
Opium did not simply dull pain. It stole time. It bent hours into shadows and made entire days disappear without memory. Workers who once rose before sunrise now slept through dawn. Farmers who once plowed steadily through seasons now abandoned fields midway through harvest. In province after province, rice yields dropped, land went untilled, irrigation systems fell into neglect, food prices soared, hunger followed. Not as sudden famine, but as a slow tightening around the throat of society. Families sold livestock first, then tools, then land. When nothing else remained, they sold their daughters. In rural villages, the sound of coughing became common. The addicted coughed not as the sick do, but as those whose lungs had learned to carry smoke instead of air. Their skin grew gray, their teeth darkened, their posture folded inward like dying branches. Children learned early what the pipe meant. They learned not to wake their fathers too quickly, not to disturb their mothers' trembling hands, not to expect food before the ritual of smoke was complete. Marriage contracts were broken by addiction, families disintegrated without violence, without rebellion, only with quiet disappearance. Death did not come in a single blow. It lingered. At first, officials condemned it. Then they taxed it. Then they joined it. By the 1850s, corruption had become inseparable from opium. Police collected bribes from den owners. Magistrates accepted payment to overlook shipments. Customs officers grew wealthy on silence. Even those appointed to suppress the trade often ran it themselves. The state no longer stood above the poison. It waded in it. The empire's administrative spine, the proud bureaucratic machine that had governed China for 2,000 years, began to bend under weight it could no longer bear. On the surface, the Qing court spoke of recovery. Silver flowed again, though much of it now vanished into foreign hands. Shanghai glittered with new buildings, treaty ports filled with strange architecture, brick warehouses, iron cranes, Western churches rising beside ancient temples. Foreign merchants called this progress. Many Chinese saw only displacement. Traditional guilds collapsed. Handcraft trades were overwhelmed by imported goods. Entire professions disappeared in a single generation. The old world was being dismantled, not through invasion alone, but through economics and addiction working quietly together. In traditional belief, the emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven. Heaven sent floods, droughts, earthquakes, and famine as warnings when rulers lost moral virtue. By the mid-1800s, those warnings began to arrive in relentless waves. The Yellow River flooded, drowning tens of thousands. Southern provinces dried into dust. Harvests failed again and again. Locusts devoured what remained. The people whispered, "Has heaven turned away?" If the emperor still ruled by divine right, why was China rotting alive? Despair breeds hunger. Hunger breeds anger. Anger searches for a voice.
That voice soon came from an unlikely place, a failed scholar, a man haunted by visions, and a message that promised salvation through destruction. Before the Taiping Rebellion erupted, China existed in an uneasy silence. Villages held together by routine. Markets still traded beneath red lanterns. Festivals were still celebrated. Life did not stop. But beneath each celebration lay tension. Officials feared rebellion. Merchants feared collapse. Farmers feared the next failed harvest. Parents feared their sons' addiction. Wives feared their husbands' return home. The empire still lived, but it no longer believed it would survive.
Imagine a single home somewhere along the Yangtze. The rice jar is empty. The eldest son has pawned his shoes for a pipe. The father stares at the wall, lost inside a cloud of smoke. The mother calculates in silence how many days remain before there is nothing left to sell. Outside, a British merchant ship drifts past on the dark river. Inside, China's future is dissolving into breath. Foreign powers did not need to conquer China directly anymore. They had discovered something far more efficient. They had learned how to weaken a nation from inside its own bloodstream. Every addict was a worker removed. Every weakened soldier was a battlefield already lost. Every corrupt official was a law already broken. No army could achieve this level of devastation without firing a shot. Opium had become a silent occupation. By 1850, conservative estimates suggested, over 12 million addicts, millions more using it casually. Entire provinces partially paralyzed, government tax revenue unstable and shrinking, military readiness deeply compromised. The Qing court issued new bans. They meant nothing. The dragon had lost its claws. What makes addiction so terrifying is not how fast it kills. It is how slowly. China did not collapse in flames after the First Opium War. It continued breathing. But each breath carried poison. Every year after 1842 felt strangely similar and yet slightly worse than the year before. No grand catastrophe, just steady decay. Buildings aged, roads deteriorated, schools emptied, armies weakened. The empire was dying the way forests die, tree by tree, leaf by leaf. For centuries, Chinese society was bound by balance. The emperor governed justly. Officials enforced order. Farmers fed the nation. Scholars preserved wisdom. Merchants supplied wealth. Opium ruptured this balance. Farmers abandoned fields. Scholars abandoned study. Soldiers abandoned duty. Officials abandoned law. When each pillar weakens at once, collapse becomes inevitable. The people felt it. They just did not yet know how it would arrive. By the late 1840s, rumors spread across southern China. Strange preachers, heavenly visions, promises of equality, promised destruction of corrupt elites, banning of opium, redistribution of land. To a starving, addicted, betrayed population, these did not sound like threats. They sounded like salvation. The First Opium War had not merely opened China's ports, it had opened a wound in the moral spine of an ancient civilization. Opium did not just destroy bodies, it unraveled trust. It poisoned law, it corroded duty. It dimmed the faith between ruler and ruled. And in that widening crack between heaven and earth,
something immense was about to rise. Not an army from abroad, but a rebellion from within. One that would drown China in blood.
Before the fires consumed the cities, before the rivers filled with bodies, before the sky itself seemed to turn away from the earth, there was a man who failed an exam. His name was Hong Xiuqian, and from that failure, one of the greatest catastrophes in human history was born. Hong Xiuqian was not born into power. He was the son of a poor Hakka family in Guangdong, raised on the same impossible dream shared by millions of Chinese boys for centuries, the dream of passing the imperial examination and rising into the scholar official class. For years he studied. For years he failed, again and again and again. Each failure shattered not just his ambition, but his identity. In Qing China, to fail the examinations was not merely to miss a career. It was to miss one's purpose in the universe. After his final collapse, Hong fell gravely ill. Fever burned through him for days, and in that burning delirium, he claimed to see heaven open. In his visions, Hong walked among clouds. A golden-haired elder called him son. Another figure, younger, scarred, and resolute, called him brother. He saw demons roaming the earth, creatures that corrupted men with smoke and greed. When he awoke, he believed the truth had been revealed. He was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He was chosen to cleanse China of demons. Among those demons were the Qing rulers and the poison of opium. At first, people laughed. A failed scholar claiming divine blood in a land governed by Confucian order was madness. But madness finds fertile ground in despair. By the late 1840s, southern China was drowning in suffering. Crops failed repeatedly, taxes remained merciless, opium destroyed families, banditry overtook the roads. Qing officials sold justice to the highest bidder.
To starving peasants, Hong's words sounded different. All men and women are equal. Land will be shared. Opium will be destroyed. Corrupt elites will be purged. Heaven itself will rule through the people. It was not merely a religion. It was a revolution wrapped in divinity. By 1850, Hong's followers numbered in the tens of thousands. By 1851, they declared open rebellion. They called their movement the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. But what followed would become the bloodiest civil war the world had ever seen. The Taiping armies moved like a living storm. They burned tax offices. They executed corrupt landlords. They smashed idols. They destroyed opium dens wherever they marched. To the poor, they were liberators. To the Qing state, they were annihilation itself. Men and women fought side by side. Entire families marched together beneath heavenly banners. Soldiers swore vows not to smoke, not to drink, not to gamble. In a nation drowning in addiction, the Taiping offered purity, and millions followed.
The Qing army, once the shield of the empire, was now riddled with decay. Years of opium addiction had corroded discipline. Soldiers deserted. Officers sold weapons. Garrison walls crumbled without maintenance. Entire units folded without battle. Time and again, the Taiping crushed imperial forces that should have outnumbered them 10-1. Cities fell. Fortresses collapsed. Provincial capitals were seized with terrifying speed. The old Qing banner retreated northward, and the heavenly kingdom marched toward the heart of China. In 1853,
the unimaginable happened. Nanjing fell, one of the great ancient capitals of China, a jewel on the Yangtze. The Taiping slaughtered the Manchu garrison inside. Tens of thousands were killed. Entire families wiped from history in a single week. Hong Xiuquan crowned Nanjing as the capital of his heavenly kingdom. He called it Tianjing, the heavenly capital. For the Qing Dynasty, this was not simply a military defeat. It was a spiritual apocalypse. From that moment on, China was split between two competing skies: the Son of Heaven in Beijing and the self-proclaimed Brother of Christ in Nanjing. Both claimed divine right, and between them lay the shattered bodies of millions. At first, the Taiping ruled with iron faith. Opium was banned under penalty of death. Private property was abolished. Land was redistributed. Women served as soldiers and officials. Traditional Confucian rituals were destroyed. To some, this felt like liberation. To others, it felt like annihilation of all meaning. Families were separated by gender. Culture was erased overnight. Ancient customs vanished in flames. China was not just fighting a civil war. It was tearing apart its own identity. Ironically, while the Taiping banned opium, the Qing increasingly depended on addicts to survive. Provincial armies, many led by warlords raised outside the corrupt Qing banner system, were funded by new taxes on opium. The state that had once forbidden the drug now survived on its revenue. Opium was no longer just poison. It had become a pillar of the wartime economy. Britain and France did not stand aside during this chaos. They watched, they calculated, they waited. And then, under new disputes and new demands, they returned with warships. Once again. The Second Opium War erupted in the late 1850s. While China bled internally from rebellion, foreign powers carved further privileges from its coastline. Beijing was violated. The Summer Palace was burned. The emperor fled. Even as millions died in civil war, the outside world kept tearing pieces from the body of China. Between 1850 and 1864, the Taiping Rebellion devoured the empire. Entire provinces vanished into famine. Rivers choked with corpses. Cities became graveyards. Farmers were conscripted at sword point by both sides. If they refused one army, the other executed them. The dead were not just soldiers, they were children, mothers, elders, entire bloodlines erased without record. Modern historians estimate over 30 million dead. Some place the number even higher. It remains one of the most lethal human conflicts ever recorded. By the early 1860s, the Qing court realized a horrifying truth. They could not defeat the Taiping alone. The empire that once called itself the center of the world had become dependent on foreign survival. Western officers trained Qing troops. Foreign guns armed imperial armies. British and French commanders coordinated with Qing generals. China was saved by the very powers that had helped destroy it. In 1864, after years of encirclement, Nanjing was surrounded. Food ran out. Disease spread. Desperation ruled the city. Hong Xiuquan, the man who once claimed divine brotherhood with Christ, died in isolation. Some say from illness, some say from starvation, some say from suicide. The heavenly capital fell soon after.
Mass execution followed. The Taiping movement was annihilated. But there was no victory, only ruin. The Taiping Rebellion ended, but China did not heal. It had lost too many sons, too many daughters, too much faith. The countryside lay empty. Fields returned to wilderness, canals clogged with silt and bones. What remained was a hollow empire stumbling forward without breath.
Opium did not cause the Taiping Rebellion alone, but it prepared the soil. It weakened the state. It starved the countryside. It broke the military. It corrupted trust. It made extreme belief feel like salvation. When the fire came, the walls were already rotting. By the time the Taiping banners finally fell, China had lost more people than Europe lost in all of its Napoleonic wars combined. And still, the pipes burned. Still, the smoke rose. Still, the empire staggered forward. The heavenly kingdom had been destroyed, but heaven itself no longer felt close to the earth. When the Taiping banners finally vanished from the burning skyline of Nanjing in 1864, the Qing Dynasty still stood, broken, bleeding, but standing. The emperors would later call it a victory. History would call it something else. Survival without recovery. For although the rebellion had ended, the disease that had weakened the empire in the first place had not been cured. The pipes were still warm. The smoke still curled. And China still slept inside its own collapse. 30 million were dead. The countryside had been emptied. Entire provinces had lost a generation of men. Rivers were unmaintained. Canals clogged. Roads shattered by years of marching armies. Granaries lay in ruins. Villages that once rang with harvest songs now stood silent, their doorways blackened by fire. Yet inside the Forbidden City, the court spoke of restoration. The dynasty would rise again. It always had. Had it not survived Mongols, rebels, floods, plague, invasions? But this time, something was different. China had not only lost people, it had lost confidence in itself. In the years after the Taiping Rebellion, Qing officials launched what they called the self-strengthening movement. Its slogan was simple: Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for function. They would keep Confucian values, but they would borrow Western machines. Shipyards were built in Shanghai and Fuzhou. Arsenals rose along the Yangtze. Telegraph lines stretched across broken land. Factories hummed beside ancient walls. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps China could still awaken. Opium remained everywhere. Soldiers trained by day and smoked by night. Officials signed reform decrees by morning and entered dens by dusk. Tax revenue still depended on the very drug that hollowed the state. The Qing government had not defeated opium. It had merely learned to profit from it. And poison that becomes profit is the hardest poison of all to abandon. On paper, China modernized. Warships gleamed with imported steel. Rifles replaced matchlocks. Uniforms grew sharper, Western in cut and color. But beneath the surface, rot remained. Training was uneven. Corruption siphoned off funds. Command structures remained tied to favoritism. Addiction still lingered inside barracks. China was building muscles,
on a skeleton that was already cracking. While China struggled to imitate the West raced forward. Steel production exploded. Electricity spread. Railroads knitted continents together. New weapons emerged with terrifying speed. China had entered modernization not at the starting line, but already exhausted halfway through the race.
Then, in the 1890s, a new enemy arrived. Not from Europe, not from across the oceans, but from just across the sea, Japan. Once a student of China's civilization, Japan had modernized with ruthless speed after the Meiji Restoration. It adopted Western industry, military discipline, education, and technology with total commitment. And now, it returned to Asia as a predator. In 1894, war broke out between China and Japan over influence in Korea. The Qing court believed it still held the mandate of regional power. It was catastrophically wrong. The First Sino-Japanese War was not a contest. It was an execution. China's modernized fleets were obliterated in days. Armies collapsed in weeks. Officers fled. Soldiers surrendered en masse. The empire that once humiliated Europe now knelt before a former tributary state. The world watched in shock. So did China. In 1895, China signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki. It lost. Taiwan, massive reparations, control over Korea, even more sovereignty. Foreign powers no longer treated China as an empire. They treated it as a carcass. Germany took territory. Russia advanced. France expanded. Britain tightened its grip. China was being carved without formal colonization because it no longer had the strength to resist. In 1898, a young emperor, Guangxu, attempted the impossible. He tried to save China in 100 days. The 100 Days Reform sought to rebuild education, law, military, economy, and governance all at once. The reformers believed China could still wake up. But the court was divided, and tradition fought back. Behind the curtain ruled Empress Dowager Cixi, once a concubine, now the most powerful figure in the empire. She saw the reforms as a threat, not only to tradition, but to her rule. And so she struck. The reformers were executed. The emperor was imprisoned in his palace. The dream of sudden awakening was crushed in silence. China returned to sleep. Soon after, another desperate movement rose from the soil. The Boxer Rebellion. Peasants and mystics who believed ritual and spirit could make them immune to bullets. They blamed foreigners for China's ruin. They attacked missionaries. They attacked Chinese Christians. They attacked anything that smelled of the outside world. For a moment, the court encouraged them. Then the foreign armies came. 8 nations marched on Beijing. The capital fell. Once again, China was forced to kneel. After 1900, something ancient finally broke. The mandate of heaven no longer convinced anyone. The emperor was no longer sacred. The dragon was no longer feared. It had become irrelevant. Students studied revolution. Soldiers questioned obedience. Writers spoke of republics, constitutions, and nationalism. The old world had lost its gravity. In 1908, both Emperor Guangxu and Empress Dowager Cixi died. The throne passed to a child, a boy named Pu Yi.
He was 3 years old. The last emperor of a civilization that no longer believed in emperors. The Qing Dynasty did not fall with a final epic battle. It did not fall in flames. It fell in exhaustion. In 1911, revolution broke out in Wuchang. Within months, province after province declared independence. The dynasty that had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries found itself alone. And in 1912, the child emperor abdicated. The dragon banner was lowered. 2,000 years of imperial rule ended not with thunder, but with paperwork. Opium did not single-handedly destroy the Qing dynasty, but it softened it. It weakened the muscles. It dulled the reflexes. It corroded the will. It made resistance slower, reform weaker, corruption easier, collapse quieter. By the time the world demanded strength from China, China had been breathing poison for generations.
The empire was gone. But the suffering it had endured did not end with it. Warlords would rise. Civil war would follow. Foreign invasions would return. And China would spend the next century trying to recover from the long sleep it had been forced into. Opium did not defeat China in a single war. It defeated it in time. It defeated it in missed harvests, in forgotten lessons, in hollowed soldiers, in broken families, in corrupted officials, in delayed awakenings. Empires can survive invasions. They can survive rebellions. But when they lose the ability to respond, when they forget how to awaken, then even the greatest civilizations in human history can fall quietly into ruin. Not with a scream, but with a sigh.